You've been taught to fear the space inside you. They told you that emptiness means something is missing, that silence is dangerous, that if you stop filling every moment you might fall apart. But if that were true, why does the space you avoid keep pulling you back? Why does noise leave you tired and stillness make you uncomfortable? Why does doing nothing feel harder than doing too much? The truth is this: the space you fear is the space that heals you. Buddhist wisdom has pointed to this for thousands of years, not as something to analyze, but as something to experience. The great teachers didn't escape emptiness. They rested in it and discovered freedom there. This space feels threatening because the mind cannot control it. There is no identity to protect, no story to repeat, no role to maintain. And yet, this is where the weight begins to lift. As you listen, you may feel resistance, a subtle urge to distract yourself, to think, to move away. This is not a mistake. This is the doorway. Stay with the space. Let it open without effort. Let it be exactly as it is. Tonight, something will soften. The pressure to become someone will loosen. The need to fix yourself will quiet. Your mind will slow, not because you forced peace, but because peace was never missing. This is not about improvement. This is about allowing what already heals. This is not another lesson to collect. This is a return to the space you've been avoiding. Are you ready? Let's begin. Before we go further, notice what is happening right now. You are still here. You didn't scroll away. Something in you stayed. That matters. It means part of you already knows that what you've been avoiding isn't dangerous, just unfamiliar. This is where we gently move deeper, not by adding more ideas, but by removing the noise that has been protecting pain for too long. Silence is not neutral to the mind, it is threatening. The moment external sound fades, the inner world becomes louder. Thoughts that were buried under conversations, notifications, music, work, and constant activity begin to surface. This is why the mind clings to noise so desperately. Noise is not entertainment. Noise is anesthesia. It keeps unresolved feelings sedated. It keeps grief unfelt, fear unnamed, and longing unexamined. When life slows down, the mind rushes to fill the gap because it senses exposure. Most people believe they fear silence because it is boring. That is not true. Boredom is only the surface story. Underneath boredom is contact. Silence removes distraction, and distraction is what keeps old emotional material out of awareness. The mind has learned over time that stillness brings sensations it doesn't know how to manage. Tightness in the chest, a hollow feeling in the stomach, a vague sense of sadness with no clear cause. Silence feels unsafe because it allows these sensations to exist without interruption. This is why constant stimulation feels comforting, even when it exhausts you. The endless scrolling, background noise, podcasts playing while doing nothing, television left on even when no one is watching. These are not habits of enjoyment. They are habits of avoidance. The mind believes that if sound keeps flowing, nothing deeper will surface. But unresolved suffering does not disappear. It waits. And the longer it waits, the louder it becomes when silence finally arrives. The fear of inner silence is not fear of nothingness. It is fear of meeting yourself without filters, without roles, without productivity, without distraction. In silence, there is no external reference to tell you who you are supposed to be. This is deeply unsettling for a mind that has built its identity around activity and reaction. When nothing is happening, the mind asks, "Who am I now?" And because it doesn't know the answer, it reaches for noise. From a Buddhist perspective, this clinging is rooted in attachment to mental movement. The mind is addicted to doing because doing creates the illusion of control. Noise creates a sense of continuity. As long as thoughts keep moving, the self feels intact. Silence threatens this continuity. It introduces gaps, and in those gaps, the self feels less solid. This is why silence can feel like falling, even when nothing bad is happening. What makes this more intense is that modern life rarely teaches anyone how to be with inner experience without reacting to it. Emotional education is almost non-existent. Most people were never shown how to sit with discomfort without fixing it. So when silence brings up discomfort, the automatic response is to escape. Not because the discomfort is unbearable, but because it feels unfamiliar and unmanageable. The mind also confuses silence with danger because of memory. Past experiences of emotional overwhelm get stored in the nervous system. Even if those experiences had nothing to do with silence directly, the body remembers moments when it felt exposed, helpless, or alone. When external stimulation drops, the nervous system senses vulnerability and sounds an internal alarm. This alarm is not logical, it is protective. It says, stay busy, stay distracted, do not stop. This is why many people feel anxious when they finally sit down at the end of the day. The body has been in motion all day. Adrenaline has been flowing, then suddenly there is stillness. The nervous system doesn't know how to downshift smoothly. Thoughts speed up instead, worries appear, regrets replay. The mind interprets this as proof that silence is harmful, when in reality it is simply unused to it. Silence feels threatening before it feels medicinal, because the first thing it does is remove suppression. It does not create pain. It reveals what was already there. This is an important distinction. Silence is like turning off bright lights in a room so your eyes can adjust. At first, everything feels darker. Shapes are unclear. The impulse is to turn the lights back on. But if you stay, your vision slowly adapts. What felt like darkness becomes clarity. Inner silence works the same way. In the beginning, the mind feels exposed. Thoughts appear louder. Emotions feel closer. There is a sense of unease. This is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that numbness is wearing off. Healing does not begin with peace. It begins with honesty, and silence is honest. The mind clings to noise because noise maintains the illusion that something else is responsible for how you feel. External input gives the sense that your state is being influenced from the outside. Silence removes that excuse. It places responsibility back into direct experience. Not responsibility in the sense of blame, but in the sense of presence. You can no longer say, I feel this way because of what I heard or saw. You are left with what is. This is uncomfortable because it dissolves distraction-based coping. Many coping strategies rely on avoiding direct contact with inner sensations. Silence removes those strategies. The mind resists this because it fears being overwhelmed. But what it does not realize is that suppression requires constant effort. Silence, once tolerated, requires none. There is also a deeper layer to this fear. Silence threatens the narrative self. The story you tell yourself about who you are depends on constant reinforcement. That reinforcement comes from thought, comparison, memory, and anticipation. Silence interrupts this loop. Without constant narration, the self feels less defined. This can feel like losing ground. But what is actually happening is a loosening of identification. Buddhist teachings describe this as the beginning of freedom. Not because the self is destroyed, but because it is no longer constantly defended. Silence creates space between thoughts. In that space, thoughts lose authority. They still arise, but they are no longer absolute. This shift is subtle but profound. It marks the transition from being trapped in mental noise to observing it. However, before this observation becomes peaceful, it feels destabilizing. The mind says, if I stop thinking, I will disappear. This is not a literal fear of death, but a psychological one. The self equates movement with existence. Silence challenges that equation. It shows that awareness continues even when thought pauses. This realization is deeply unsettling at first because it contradicts everything the mind has relied on. This is why silence often triggers restlessness rather than calm. Restlessness is the mind's attempt to reassert control. It searches for something to do, something to fix, something to consume. It may even create problems to think about. This is not because problems suddenly appeared, but because thinking feels safer than not thinking. The healing quality of silence emerges only when this initial resistance is allowed rather than fought. When you stop trying to make silence peaceful and instead let it be uncomfortable, something unexpected happens. The discomfort does not grow, it softens, not because it was fixed, but because it was finally felt without interruption. Unresolved suffering feeds on avoidance. It gains strength when it is ignored. Silence starves it by removing the fuel of distraction. This does not mean suffering vanishes instantly. It means it begins to lose its grip. Sensations move through instead of looping endlessly. Emotions rise and fall instead of being frozen. The mind learns slowly that silence is survivable. Then it learns that silence is informative. Then eventually it learns that silence is kind. But this progression cannot be rushed. The first phase is always resistance. This is where most people turn back. They mistake resistance for danger. But resistance is simply habit encountering change. When silence is approached gently, without expectation, the nervous system begins to recalibrate. The body learns that it can be still without threat. This is not an intellectual realization. It is a physiological one. Breath deepens, muscles soften. The constant background tension begins to ease. This is why silence becomes medicinal. Not because it adds something new, but because it allows the system to return to balance. Another reason the mind clings to noise is that noise provides structure. It fills time. Silence exposes the open-ended nature of existence. There is no clear next step in silence. This openness can feel disorienting. The mind prefers known patterns, even painful ones, over uncertainty. Silence offers no script. That is both its danger and its gift. In the absence of noise, the mind begins to see how much energy it spends, maintaining unnecessary tension. It notices repetitive thought patterns. It sees how often it replays the past or rehearses the future. This seeing is not judgment, it is awareness. And awareness, once established, naturally reduces suffering without effort. Silence does not demand that you confront everything at once. It works in layers. At first, you notice surface thoughts, then deeper emotional currents, then subtle bodily sensations. Each layer reveals itself only when the system is ready. This is why silence heals without force. It respects the pace of the nervous system. What makes silence transformative is not the absence of sound, but the absence of interference. When experience is allowed to arise and pass without manipulation, it completes itself. Trauma, anxiety, and chronic stress persist not because they are too strong, but because they are constantly interrupted. Silence gives them space to resolve. This is why the space you fear holds healing. Fear signals the edge of familiarity, not the presence of danger. The mind fears silence because silence exposes the truth that nothing needs to be constantly managed. This truth undermines the identity built around effort and control. As silence becomes more familiar, something shifts. The urge to fill it weakens. The need for constant input fades. You begin to trust that nothing bad happens when you stop. This trust is not blind. It is earned through direct experience. And once it is earned, silence stops feeling empty. It feels full, not with content, but with presence. This presence is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It feels simple, grounded, quietly supportive. It is the feeling of being here without needing to be elsewhere, of existing without commentary, of resting without guilt. The mind clings to noise because it has forgotten this state. Silence reintroduces it gently but firmly. At first it feels like loss. Over time it reveals itself as return. As the noise softens and silence no longer feels like an enemy, something deeper begins to shift. You may notice that even without distraction, there is still tension. Not loud, not dramatic, but subtle. A quiet pressure to become something, to arrive somewhere, to finally be enough. This is where the next layer reveals itself, not in sound, but in effort. There is a moment that comes quietly, almost unnoticed, when the mind grows tired of negotiating. Not tired in a sleepy way, but exhausted from trying to secure itself. For most of life, the mind is constantly bargaining. It tells itself, if I achieve this, then I'll relax. If I'm understood, then I'll feel real. If I find the right role, purpose, or identity, then everything will settle. This negotiation runs in hint form, not always as clear thoughts, but as background tension. Even in silence, it can persist. Emptiness enters when this bargaining loses energy, not because the mind wins, but because it runs out of leverage. After silence exposes how much effort is spent avoiding discomfort, emptiness exposes how much effort is spent trying to become someone. The mind begins to see that every identity it reaches for is temporary. Every purpose it attaches to eventually shifts or collapses. Every source of validation fades. This recognition is not depressing at first. It is confusing. The mind has been trained to believe that identity equals safety. Without a clear answer to who am I or what am I for, it feels unprotected. This is why the mind negotiates endlessly. It tries to strike deals with the future. Once this happens, I'll finally be okay. These deals keep the self intact. They create forward motion. They give the illusion of direction. Emptiness interrupts this movement. When emptiness deepens, the mind is no longer interested in better versions of itself. Improvement loses its shine, not because growth is wrong, but because growth was being used as a shield. The mind begins to sense that no amount of refinement will solve the underlying restlessness. This is the collapse point, not dramatic, quiet, the moment when striving feels hollow. This collapse is often misunderstood as giving up. It is not. Giving up still has an object. You give up on something. Emptiness is different. It is the falling away of the one who was trying. The mind stops negotiating, not because it accepts defeat, but because it sees there was no contract to begin with. Identity is built through repetition. Roles repeated often enough begin to feel solid. Emptiness loosens this solidity. You may notice that labels lose their weight. Achievements feel distant. Failures feel less personal. This does not happen all at once. It unfolds as clarity. You see that identity was never stable, only familiar. Emptiness does not take identity away. It reveals its fluid nature. The same happens with purpose. Purpose is often framed as something you must discover or fulfill. This creates pressure. It suggests that without a clear mission, something is wrong. Emptiness dissolves this pressure by exposing its source. The mind wanted purpose to justify existence, to explain why you are here. Emptiness removes the need for explanation. Existence no longer requires justification. This is deeply unsettling at first. The question, what gives my life meaning, echoes loudly in the early stages of emptiness. But over time, the question weakens, not because it was answered, but because it no longer feels necessary. Life begins to feel self-validating, not meaningful in a dramatic sense, but sufficient. Validation is the last stronghold of negotiation. Even when identity and purpose begin to loosen, the mind still seeks confirmation, approval, recognition, signs that it is doing okay. Emptiness confronts this by offering nothing back. No praise, No reassurance, no rejection either, just space. In this space, the craving for validation is exposed as habit, not need. At first, the absence of feedback feels cold. The mind is used to mirrors, social response, inner commentary. Emptiness removes these mirrors. You are no longer reflected back to yourself. This can feel like disappearing. But what actually disappears is dependence, the need to be seen in order to exist. As negotiation ends, clarity emerges. Not conceptual clarity, but perceptual clarity. You begin to see thoughts as events rather than instructions. You notice how often the mind was trying to position itself favorably. This seeing is not judgmental, it is neutral. And because it is neutral, it is freeing. One of the most surprising effects of emptiness is relief. The constant internal dialogue softens. Decisions feel lighter. Not because you suddenly know the right answer, but because the stakes are lower. Choices no longer define you, they are simply choices. This restores a natural simplicity to action. The end of self-negotiation also ends comparison. Comparison relies on identity. It requires a solid self to measure against others. When identity loosens, comparison loses traction. You may still notice differences, but they no longer translate into worth. This is not a cultivated attitude. It is a byproduct of emptiness. Clarity also appears in relationships. Without the need to be someone specific, interactions become less performative. You listen more, you defend less, not because you are trying to be better, but because there is less to protect. Emptiness creates honesty by removing agenda. This does not mean passivity. Emptiness does not make you indifferent, it makes you responsive. Action arises from the situation itself, not from a self-image that needs maintenance. This is why clarity feels clean. There is less friction between inner state and outer action. Another shift happens around time. Self-negotiation is future-oriented. It constantly references what will happen later. Emptiness brings attention back to what is happening now, not as a practice, but as a default. Without a self to secure in the future, the present becomes sufficient. This sufficiency is subtle. It does not announce happiness. It feels like steadiness, like standing without leaning. The mind no longer needs to brace itself against uncertainty. Uncertainty remains, but it is no longer threatening. It is simply part of movement. Emptiness also reveals how much effort was spent maintaining consistency. Trying to be the same person across situations. Trying to align with expectations. Trying to make sense. When this effort drops, there is more energy hint available. Not dramatic energy, but usable energy. The kind that supports clarity and care. The collapse of self-negotiation is not a permanent state you enter and stay in. The mind will try to renegotiate. This is natural. What changes is that you see it happening. Negotiation becomes transparent, and transparency weakens its grip. Over time, emptiness stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like openness. Not openness as an idea, but as lived space. There is room for experience without needing to define it. This room is what allows clarity to persist without effort. Clarity restored through emptiness is not sharp or analytical. It is soft and precise. You see what is needed without overthinking. You respond without rehearsing. You rest without guilt. This clarity does not come from understanding more. It comes from needing less. The end of bargaining also ends self-blame. Blame assumes a self that could have negotiated better. When that self is seen through, blame loses meaning. Responsibility remains, but it is clean. You respond to consequences without adding judgment. This is why emptiness feels frightening before it feels freeing. It threatens the systems that once provided direction. But once those systems collapse, something more stable appears. Not an identity, but a groundedness that does not depend on conditions. From this groundedness, life continues. You still work, you still care, you still make choices. But the inner pressure is gone. The constant question, "Am I enough yet?" no longer drives you. Not because it was answered, but because it dissolved. This is the quiet power of emptiness. It ends the endless negotiation by revealing it was unnecessary. And in that ending, clarity returns. Not as a goal achieved, but as a natural state uncovered. As clarity returns and the mind stops begging life to prove your worth, a strange new problem can appear. Not the old stress, not the old noise, something quieter, sharper, and more confusing. You finally get space inside you, and instead of relief, you feel a flicker of fear. Not fear of failure, fear of openness, fear of being unheld, fear that if you relax all the way, something in you will vanish. This is one of the most misunderstood moments on any inner path. People think peace should feel safe right away. They think spaciousness should feel like warm light. But for the ego, openness can feel like death. Not poetic death, not symbolic death. Real panic in the body, tight throat, fast heartbeat, a need to grab onto something, anything, just to feel solid again. In Buddhist psychology, this reaction makes perfect sense. The ego is not an evil thing. It is a survival strategy. It is a pattern of gripping. It is a system that organizes experience into me and mine, so the mind can predict, control, and defend. The ego is basically a manager. It keeps track of threats. It keeps track of status. It keeps track of what you should be. It holds your story together like glue. And when spaciousness appears, that glue starts to loosen. Openness is dangerous to the ego because the ego depends on edges. It depends on separation. It needs clear lines. This is me. That is not me. This is my role. That is not my role. This is my value. That is not my value. Spaciousness does not respect those lines. Spaciousness is wide. It is unowned. It is not personal. It does not flatter the self or fight for the self. It simply allows everything to arise and pass. And the ego hears that as a threat because the ego survives by being the center of the room. This is why a person can sit quietly and suddenly feel like something is wrong, even when life is fine. The mind opens, the usual inner structure fades, and the nervous system reacts as if a cliff just appeared. The body says, get back, hold on. It can feel like losing your ground, and for the ego, that is exactly what is happening. Ground is identity. Ground is certainty. Ground is the familiar tension of holding yourself together. Buddhism explains this through the way the self is constructed. The Buddha pointed to experience as a flow, not a fixed thing. The sense of I is not a solid object hidden inside you. It is built moment by moment through clinging to sensations, clinging to thoughts, clinging to moods, clinging to memories, clinging to control. When clinging relaxes, the I that was built from that clinging feels weaker, and the ego panics because it thinks it is dying. In reality, what is dying is not you. What is dissolving is a habit of identification. This is why the fear can be so primal. The ego is tied to basic survival circuits. It treats psychological dissolving like physical danger. Even if your mind understands this is just spaciousness, the body may still react. Because the ego is not only a belief system, it is a felt system. It lives in muscle tension, breath patterns, vigilance, and the urge to control outcomes. There is also something else. The ego is built on continuity. It needs a timeline. It needs past and future to remain meaningful so it can maintain a stable self-image. Spaciousness weakens that timeline. In openness, the past becomes less sticky. The future becomes less gripping. The present becomes more immediate. This sounds like peace, but the ego experiences it like losing its tools. The ego says, if I cannot reference who I was or who I will be, what am I? That question can feel like free fall. In Buddhist terms, this is the fear of groundlessness. The mind is used to leaning on concepts, roles, plans, explanations. When those supports fade, the mind senses nakedness. It feels exposed, not because you are actually unsafe, but because the old armor is coming off. And armor always feels protective until you try to remove it. Then you realize how much you depended on the weight of it to feel real. The ego also experiences spaciousness as death because it cannot control it. Openness is not a state you can own. The moment you try to own it, it shrinks. The moment you try to use it, it becomes another project. Spaciousness is free by nature. It is not obedient. It does not follow the ego's plans. It does not give the ego credit. And this is humiliating for the part of the mind that lives on credit. This is why many people sabotage their own inner openness. They get a taste of freedom, then suddenly they start problems. They pick fights. They overwork. They numb out. They create drama. They return to familiar stress, not because they love suffering, but because suffering gives the ego a job. It gives it purpose. It gives it identity. Even painful identity can feel safer than open space, because painful identity is still identity. Buddhism often describes the ego as something like a knot. Not a monster, not an enemy, but a tightening. Spaciousness is the untying of that knot, and when a knot begins to loosen, there can be a feeling of losing shape. The ego says, if I loosen, I will disappear. But what disappears is the knotting itself. What remains is awareness, wide and steady, that does not need to be tightened into a person in order to be present. Yet the ego will argue. It will bring fear-based logic. It will say, if you don't hold yourself together, you'll become nothing. It will say, if you stop controlling, everything will fall apart. It will say, if you stop defining yourself, you'll be worthless. These are not random thoughts. They are the ego's emergency alarms, and they are persuasive because they are tied to the body's sense of safety. This is where a Buddhist analysis becomes practical, not philosophical. Buddhism does not ask you to believe in emptiness as an idea. It invites you to observe how the self is assembled. You can watch it in real time. A sensation appears in the body. A thought labels it. The label becomes a story. The story becomes me. Then me becomes defensive. Spaciousness interrupts this chain. It slows the labeling. It weakens the story. It reveals the raw sensation without the identity wrapper. And the ego panics because it cannot convert experience into me fast enough. A common example is emotional openness. You sit quietly. A wave of sadness appears. The ego wants to turn it into a story. This means something about me. This means I'm broken. This means my life is wrong. Spaciousness allows the sadness to exist without that story. And the ego hates this because it cannot claim the emotion as identity. It cannot use the sadness to justify its usual strategies. It cannot bargain with it. It cannot make it personal in the old way. So it tries a different tactic: fear. It says, if you don't make sense of this, you'll drown. But often, when you stay open, the sadness moves through. Not because you solved it, but because you stopped trapping it inside a self-story. Another reason openness triggers panic is that the ego is deeply social. It is not just my thoughts, it is also my place. The ego tracks belonging, it tracks reputation, it tracks how you are seen. Spaciousness makes these concerns feel less urgent, which sounds good, but the ego treats it as social danger. It says, if you stop caring, you will be rejected. This is why people sometimes feel fear when they stop seeking approval. The ego interprets freedom from approval as risking exile because in ancient times exile could mean death. The body carries that old wiring, so the ego's panic is not silly, it is ancient. In Buddhism, this is part of why compassion is so central. When spaciousness arises and fear comes with it, harshness makes everything worse. If you attack the ego, you reinforce the war. You strengthen the feeling that something is wrong. But if you meet the fear with kindness, you teach the nervous system a new lesson. Openness is not danger. Openness is allowed. Openness is survivable. This is not about forcing the ego to die. It is about letting the ego relax. There is also a subtle trap that appears here, spiritual panic disguised as spiritual ambition. The ego may fear openness, but it may also try to control it by becoming the one who is open. It turns spaciousness into a badge. It turns peace into an identity. It starts measuring, am I awakened enough? Am I calm enough? This is just the ego wearing meditation clothes, and when you see this, you understand why openness threatens the ego so much. The ego will try to own anything that feels powerful, even the thing meant to free you from ownership. So what is liberation in this context? Liberation is not a dramatic experience that destroys the self. Liberation is the end of taking the self so seriously. It is seeing the ego as a process rather than a person. The ego becomes like weather. Sometimes it tightens, sometimes it softens. But it is no longer the ruler of reality. Spaciousness is the sky. Ego is the cloud. When you mistake the cloud for the whole sky, every shift feels like life and death. When you recognize the sky, the clouds can come and go without terror. But before the recognition stabilizes, the ego goes through what feels like an existential crisis. This is why openness triggers panic before it becomes freedom. The ego is losing its central role, and it calls that loss death. In many Buddhist traditions, this is described as meeting Mara, the force of confusion and fear that tries to pull you back into grasping. Mara is not a demon outside you. Mara is the collection of inner strategies that keep you asleep. When openness appears, Mara appears too, as fear, doubt, restlessness, and the urge to turn back. This is not a sign you're doing it wrong. It is a sign you're touching the real edge. Many people only taste calm that sits on top of control. They learn to be calm as long as life behaves. But openness is different. Openness is calm that does not depend on control, and the ego will resist that because control is its main currency. A helpful way to understand this is to see that the ego does not actually want you to suffer. It wants you to be safe. It just uses outdated methods. It believes tension equals safety. It believes thinking equals safety. It believes planning equals safety. It believes identity equals safety. Spaciousness says, safety is possible without those. The ego hears, we are no longer needed. And being unneeded feels like death to any part of the mind that built its worth on being necessary. This is why the fear can show up as a feeling of meaninglessness. Not because life has no meaning, but because the ego's meaning is collapsing. Ego meaning is meaning that proves the self. It is meaning that says, I matter because I achieve, because I'm special, because I'm recognized. Spaciousness is meaning without a salesman. It is the quiet sense of being alive without needing a reason. But before that quiet meaning is felt, the ego experiences the loss of its old meaning as emptiness in the negative sense, like a vacuum. This is the transitional pain. The Buddhist word emptiness often scares people because they assume it means nothing exists. That is not what it points to. It points to the absence of fixed, independent essence. Things exist, but they exist in relationship, in movement, in change. The self exists too, but not as a solid core. It is a pattern. Spaciousness reveals this, and the ego panics because it was pretending to be solid. When you begin to taste openness, you might notice moments where the sense of me is not as loud. You are walking, and for a second, there is just walking. You are listening, and for a second, there is just sound. You are breathing, and for a second, there is just breath. Then suddenly, the ego returns and says, "Wait, who is walking? Who is listening?" That snapback can feel startling, but it shows you the mechanism. The ego reasserts itself because it fears disappearing, even though the disappearing was peaceful. This is where a simple approach helps. Let the ego come back without treating it as failure. Openness is not ruined by the return of selfing. The return is part of the training. Each time you notice the ego grabbing, you are no longer fully inside the grab. That noticing is already spaciousness. The ego will still claim center stage, but it is being watched now, which changes everything. Another layer of panic comes from the fear of losing desire. The ego often equates desire with life. It says, if you stop wanting, you will become flat. You will stop caring. You will become passive. Spaciousness can feel like desire weakening, and the ego interprets it as loss of vitality. But there is a difference between compulsive wanting and natural aliveness. Compulsive wanting is restless. Natural aliveness is present. When openness grows, compulsive wanting softens, but aliveness does not disappear. In fact, many people report a cleaner joy, a simpler appreciation, once the constant hunger quiets. The ego just cannot predict that, so it fears it. A Buddhist analysis would say the ego mistakes grasping for love. It mistakes attachment for connection. It mistakes control for care. Spaciousness exposes these confusions, and anything exposed feels dangerous to the system built on it. So how does panic turn into liberation? Not by fighting panic, not by trying to think your way out. Liberation comes through staying close to direct experience while the ego screams. That sounds intense, but it can be gentle. Staying close means feeling the body, feeling the breath, feeling the present moment without adding extra story. When panic rises, you don't need to call it spiritual failure. You can call it what it is, the ego reacting to openness. This naming alone can reduce fear, because fear grows when it is mysterious. When you recognize the pattern, you stop believing it completely. You might still feel the sensations, but you no longer treat them as prophecy. The body can shake while the mind remains clear. This is just the old system reacting. It also helps to understand that existential panic is often a threshold. The ego is a border guard. When you approach freedom, the border guard shows up. It checks your papers. It creates doubt. It creates urgency. It tries to send you back to familiar territory. If you always obey, you never leave. If you stay calmly, the guard eventually relaxes. Not because you won, but because it learns you are not harming yourself. Over time, spaciousness stops feeling like death and starts feeling like rest. The ego still appears, but it is lighter. It becomes a tool rather than a prison. You can use identity when needed without being used by it. You can plan without being trapped in the future. You can care without clinging. You can act without making every action a self-definition. This is liberation in simple terms. Life happens, and you don't have to turn it into a tight story about you. You still have preferences, you still have responsibilities, you still have a personality, but you are no longer trapped in the belief that you are a fixed thing that must be protected at all costs. And here is the quiet surprise. When the ego stops fighting spaciousness, you don't become less human. You become more available, more present, more honest. You can feel pain without turning it into identity. You can feel joy without fearing its loss. You can meet others without using them as mirrors. Spaciousness becomes intimacy with life, not distance from it. That is why the ego experiences openness as death before liberation. Because liberation is the end of the ego's dictatorship. The ego calls that death. Awareness calls it freedom. And the path is simply learning to stay long enough to see which one is telling the truth. As the fear around openness loosens and the ego no longer feels like it is about to disappear, another layer quietly reveals itself. You may notice a strange emptiness where pressure used to live, not sadness, not relief, just the absence of a constant push. And in that absence, a question surfaces that most people never allow themselves to ask. Who are you when nothing needs you? This question can feel unsettling because usefulness has been a lifelong anchor. From early on, many people learned that being needed meant being safe. Being useful meant being loved. Being productive meant being worthy. This conditioning runs deep. Even when the ego loosens its grip, this habit can remain, hiding beneath good intentions. Emptiness brings it into view. The compulsion to be useful is not the same as care. Care is natural, compulsion is driven. It carries tension, it carries urgency. It says, if I am not contributing, I am failing. This belief becomes a quiet engine behind burnout. Not the kind of burnout that comes only from too much work, but the deeper kind that comes from never being allowed to rest inside yourself. When emptiness deepens, usefulness loses its central role. Not because contribution becomes meaningless, but because existence no longer needs justification. This is where the healing begins. Being unneeded does not mean being unwanted. It means no longer being required to perform in order to belong. Burnout is often misunderstood as a problem of workload. But many people burn out even when they slow down. They rest physically, but the inner pressure continues. Why? Because the true exhaustion is not in the body. It is in the identity that believes it must constantly prove its value. Emptiness dissolves this belief by removing the stage on which performance once mattered. At first, being unneeded can feel like rejection. The nervous system interprets it as loss of relevance. This reaction is understandable. Human beings evolved in groups where usefulness often meant survival. If you were needed, you stayed. If you were not, you were at risk. That ancient wiring still lives in the body. So when emptiness removes the sense of being required, fear can arise. But this fear is not a sign of danger. It is a sign of conditioning loosening. As emptiness stabilizes, something surprising happens. Without the pressure to be significant, attention becomes clearer. You begin to act from responsiveness instead of obligation. You help because help is needed, not because you need to be needed. This distinction changes everything. It removes resentment. It removes overextension. It removes the quiet anger that comes from giving too much without rest. Many people confuse self-worth with usefulness. They believe that if they stop producing, they will disappear. Emptiness gently disproves this. In moments where nothing is demanded of you, awareness still remains, breath still moves, presence still exists. This shows the nervous system that worth is not transactional. It does not rise and fall with output. This realization heals burnout at its root, because burnout is not just exhaustion. It is the collapse of meaning under constant pressure. When meaning is tied to productivity, rest feels like failure. Emptiness untangles this. It shows that rest is not a break from life. It is part of life when life is no longer being negotiated. The compulsion to be significant is closely related to the fear of being ordinary. Many people push themselves not because they love what they do, but because they fear being invisible. Emptiness removes this fear by making invisibility safe. In the absence of constant recognition, there is still presence, there is still being. This is deeply soothing to the system. From a Buddhist perspective, significance is another form of clinging. It is clinging to an idea of impact, legacy, or importance as proof of existence. Emptiness reveals that existence does not need proof. The need to leave a mark relaxes, and with that relaxation comes a lighter way of engaging with the world. This does not lead to apathy, it leads to balance. When the need to matter dissolves, actions become cleaner. You can work without over-identifying. You can rest without guilt. You can say no without fear. You can say yes without self-erasure. This balance is what prevents burnout, not time off alone. Another layer of healing comes from the end of over-responsibility. Many people carry the weight of others' emotions, outcomes, and choices. They feel responsible for fixing, saving, supporting beyond their capacity. This often comes from the belief that being needed equals being loved. Emptiness loosens this belief. It allows responsibility to return to its proper place. When emptiness is present, you can care deeply without absorbing everything. You can support without rescuing. You can be available without disappearing into others' needs. This boundary is not created through effort. It emerges naturally when your worth is no longer tied to usefulness. Burnout often includes a loss of joy. Things that once mattered feel flat. This is not because the world lost color, but because the system has been overused. Constant striving dulls perception. Emptiness restores sensitivity by removing strain. When you stop forcing meaning, small experiences regain depth. A quiet moment, a simple task, a shared glance, these become enough. There is also healing in no longer being essential. When you realize that life continues without your constant input, a deep relaxation occurs. The world does not collapse when you stop managing it. This realization can feel humbling at first, but humility here is not humiliation, it is relief. You are no longer carrying the illusion that everything depends on you. This is where burnout truly ends. Not when you do less, but when you stop believing you must hold everything together. Emptiness teaches the nervous system that it can release control without catastrophe. This is a bodily learning, not a concept. Over time, the constant readiness fades. The background tension dissolves. The healing power of being unneeded also touches creativity. When creation is no longer driven by validation, it becomes playful again. You can explore without outcome. You can create without pressure. This restores energy because play does not drain in the same way performance does. Many people fear that if they stop being useful, they will lose connection. The opposite often happens. Without the role of helper, fixer, or achiever, relationships become more honest. You meet others as they are, not as projects. This deepens connection rather than weakening it. Emptiness also heals burnout by ending the internal scoreboard. The mind often keeps track of effort, sacrifice, and contribution. It asks, have I done enough? This question never has an answer because it is not meant to. Emptiness removes the scoreboard entirely. Effort is no longer measured against worth. As this shift deepens, time changes texture. You are no longer rushing toward the next task to feel complete. Moments stretch. Presence fills the space that urgency once occupied. This slows the system in a way sleep alone cannot. The idea of being unneeded may still trigger discomfort at times. That is normal. Conditioning does not vanish overnight. But each time you rest in emptiness and nothing bad happens, trust grows. The nervous system learns that being is enough. This trust changes how you engage with work. You can still be dedicated. You can still be skillful, but you are no longer consumed. Work becomes something you do, not something you are. This distinction protects energy at the deepest level. The healing here is subtle but profound. It is the healing of identity fatigue, the exhaustion of always being someone for someone else. Emptiness gives permission to simply exist, and in that permission, the system recovers. When the compulsion to be useful dissolves, you may notice grief. Grief for how long you pushed, how much you carried, how little rest you allowed yourself. Emptiness holds this grief without commentary. It does not rush it away, and because it is held without urgency, it moves through. This is why emptiness heals burnout at the root. It does not fix symptoms. It removes the beliefs that caused the strain. It shows that life does not need to be earned. That presence does not require productivity. That worth is not something you perform. From this place, action arises naturally. Sometimes you help, sometimes you rest, sometimes you do nothing at all, and all of it is allowed. This allowance is not laziness, it is balance restored. The quiet truth revealed here is simple but radical. You are allowed to exist without being needed, and when this truth is embodied, the deepest exhaustion finally lets go. As the pressure to be useful finally releases, another habit quietly steps forward. Even without striving to matter, the mind may still search for something to correct, a subtle scanning, a gentle dissatisfaction, a sense that something inside still needs work. This is where many people get stuck for years, endlessly refining themselves without ever resting. This next layer begins when that impulse starts to weaken. There comes a point where the effort to improve begins to feel heavy rather than hopeful, not because growth is wrong, but because the motivation behind it is exposed. You may notice that the desire to fix yourself was never really about joy. It was about escape. Escape from discomfort, escape from shame, escape from the feeling that who you are as you are is not enough. Emptiness brings this realization without accusation. Self-help is built on a quiet assumption: something is wrong with you. Even the most positive language often hides this belief. Be better, heal faster, become more confident, release trauma, find your purpose. These messages can inspire at first, but over time they create pressure. They keep the nervous system in a constant state of becoming. Emptiness interrupts this momentum. When emptiness deepens, the idea of improvement starts to lose meaning. Not because life stops unfolding, but because the self that needed fixing is no longer solid. The mind begins to sense that every attempt to fix itself was reinforcing the belief that it was broken. This realization can feel both relieving and unsettling. If you are not a problem, then what have you been working on all this time? This is where genuine healing begins. Not when you finally solve yourself, but when the project of solving yourself collapses. The collapse does not happen through logic. It happens through exhaustion. The mind eventually sees that no version of itself ever arrives permanently. Every improvement becomes the new baseline. Every breakthrough becomes the next thing to protect. Emptiness reveals the endlessness of this cycle. At first, letting go of self-help can feel irresponsible. The mind worries that without effort, everything will fall apart. It says, if I stop fixing myself, I'll regress. This fear is understandable. It is based on the belief that control equals stability. Emptiness gently disproves this belief by showing that life continues without constant management. Healing beyond self-help does not mean ignoring pain. It means relating to pain differently. Instead of treating pain as a flaw to eliminate, emptiness allows pain to be felt as experience. Sensations arise, emotions move, thoughts appear and dissolve. Nothing needs to be corrected for this process to unfold. In fact, correction often interrupts it. One of the most exhausting aspects of self-help is the constant self-monitoring. Am I doing this right? Am I progressing? Am I healed yet? This monitoring keeps attention locked on the self. Emptiness releases attention from this loop. Awareness opens outward and inward at the same time, without fixation. This reduces strain immediately. Another hidden cost of self-help is comparison. You compare your progress to others. You measure your healing against timelines. You judge yourself for still struggling. Emptiness ends this because there is no longer a race. Without a destination, there is no one ahead or behind. Experience unfolds at its own pace. From a Buddhist perspective, the desire to fix oneself is another form of craving. It is craving for a future self that feels better than the present one. This craving keeps dissatisfaction alive. Emptiness reveals that peace cannot be postponed. It is either present now or it is an idea. This does not mean nothing changes. Change still happens. but it happens organically rather than forcefully. Habits soften, insight deepens, behavior adjusts. These shifts are responses to clarity, not results of pressure. They do not require constant reinforcement because they are not fighting against what is. One of the most profound shifts that occurs when self-help falls away is a change in how you relate to your past. Instead of endlessly processing, analyzing, and reframing, there is simple acknowledgement. What happened, happened. The body remembers what it needs to remember. Emptiness does not erase memory. It removes obsession. Trauma, in particular, responds differently in emptiness. Rather than being worked through cognitively, it unwinds somatically. The nervous system releases tension when it feels safe enough to do so. This safety does not come from understanding more. It comes from not being pushed. Self-help often treats the mind as the primary agent of healing. Emptiness shifts healing to the whole system: body, breath, sensation, awareness. This holistic process does not follow steps. It follows readiness, and readiness cannot be forced. There is also a subtle humility that arises here. Without the project of self-improvement, you stop assuming you know what needs to change. You listen more. You respond rather than plan. This humility is not weakness. It is alignment with reality as it is. Many people fear that abandoning self-help means settling, but emptiness does not settle for less. It settles into truth. It removes the illusion that fulfillment lies somewhere else. This makes engagement with life more sincere. You no longer chase transformation, you allow it. Another layer of healing appears in relationships. When you are no longer trying to fix yourself, you stop trying to fix others. You meet people where they are. This reduces conflict. It increases patience. It deepens connection. The end of self-help also ends the subtle violence of self-rejection. Even gentle improvement carries the message, "You are not okay yet." Emptiness replaces this with acceptance that is not conditional. This acceptance is not complacency, it is kindness. Kindness changes how you handle difficulty. Instead of immediately asking, "How do I get rid of this?" you ask, "Can this be here?" This shift reduces resistance, and resistance is what turns discomfort into suffering. Emptiness beyond self-help reveals that healing is not an achievement. It is a natural movement toward balance when interference stops. This is why so many people feel relief when they stop trying. The system knows how to regulate itself when it is not constantly corrected. There is also freedom from identity here. You are no longer the one who is healing. You are no longer the one who is broken. You are simply experiencing life. This simplicity removes layers of self-consciousness that drain energy. The mind may still reach for techniques occasionally. That is okay. Emptiness does not forbid tools. It just removes dependence on them. Tools become optional rather than essential. This changes their effect. Over time, you may notice that problems resolve themselves without intervention, or they lose their emotional charge even if they remain. This is because they are no longer being fed by resistance. Emptiness starves unnecessary suffering. Another important shift is trust. Trust in the process of life. Trust in the body's intelligence. Trust in awareness itself. This trust cannot be manufactured. It grows through repeated experience of not fixing and discovering that nothing breaks. The desire to improve oneself often comes from fear of being left behind. Emptiness removes this fear by showing that there is nowhere to arrive. You are already in the middle of life. Nothing is missing. This realization can feel anticlimactic. There is no grand finish line, no final version of you, but there is relief. And relief is underrated. Relief allows joy to emerge quietly. The end of self-help also ends spiritual ambition, the urge to awaken faster, to be more evolved, to transcend others. Emptiness dissolves hierarchy. There is no higher self to reach. There is only this moment. From this place, learning continues, but without self-pressure. Growth happens, but without self-judgment. Healing unfolds, but without urgency. This is sustainable. This is kind. One of the deepest healings here is the restoration of trust in being. You no longer feel like a problem to solve. You feel like a process to live. This shifts everything. The mind may still whisper, "But shouldn't I do something?" And sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes it is no. Emptiness allows both without conflict. What remains when nothing is left to improve is not emptiness as lack. It is emptiness as openness. Space where life can move freely. Space where pain can pass. Space where joy can arise without being claimed. This is why genuine healing begins only after the desire to fix yourself evaporates. Because healing is not about becoming someone else. It is about no longer fighting who you are. And in that absence of struggle, something very simple and very deep becomes available. Peace that does not depend on progress. As the need to fix yourself finally loosens, something gentler becomes noticeable. Not a breakthrough, not an insight, a pause, brief, almost easy to miss. A small gap where nothing is being judged, corrected, or improved. This is not emptiness as an idea. This is emptiness as refuge. Trauma does not live only in memory. It lives in the body's timing, in the way the nervous system expects danger even when none is present, in the way thoughts arrive already charged, already urgent. For many people, healing has been framed as revisiting the past, reliving what happened, talking it through again and again. While this can help some, it can also keep the system trapped in repetition. The body re-enters survival mode each time the story is replayed. Emptiness offers another way. Between one thought and the next, there is a gap. It may last a fraction of a second. It may feel unremarkable, but that gap is not neutral. It is regulation. It is the nervous system experiencing safety without narrative. Trauma cannot operate there because trauma requires continuity. It needs a story, a threat, a remembered danger. The space between thoughts has none of these. When you stop trying to fix yourself, you stop chasing thoughts. This allows the gaps to become more visible. At first, they appear accidentally. You notice a moment of quiet after a thought ends, before the next one begins. There is no meaning there, no memory, just presence. This presence is deeply stabilizing to the nervous system. Trauma keeps the system locked in anticipation. Even when nothing is happening, the body prepares. Muscles stay tight, breath stays shallow, attention stays alert. The space between thoughts interrupts this loop. It signals to the body that there is no immediate demand. Over time, repeated exposure to this signal teaches the nervous system a new pattern. This is not intellectual learning. The body does not learn through explanation. It learns through experience. Each micro moment of emptiness is an experience of non-threat. And unlike cognitive reassurance, this experience does not argue with fear. It simply bypasses it. Many people are afraid that if they stop thinking, painful memories will flood in. Sometimes this happens briefly, but often the opposite occurs. Painful material tends to arise when the mind is actively searching or analyzing. When attention rests in the space between thoughts, there is no momentum to carry the mind backward. Memory loses its grip because there is nothing pulling on it. This is why emptiness can heal trauma without reliving pain. Trauma feeds on identification. This happened to me. This defines me. This is still happening. The space between thoughts does not deny what happened, but it does not reinforce identity around it. Sensations may arise, but without story, they move differently. They complete themselves instead of looping. The nervous system responds first. Breath deepens slightly, muscles release without instruction, heart rate settles. These changes are subtle but cumulative. Over time, the baseline shifts. The body no longer expects constant threat. One of the most important aspects of this process is that it does not require effort. Trauma healing often fails when it becomes another project, another thing to do right, another area where you feel behind. The space between thoughts cannot be forced. It appears when effort drops. This makes it accessible even to systems that are exhausted. The mind may try to turn this into a technique. It may say, "I need to find the gap." This effort collapses the gap immediately. The space appears only when the mind stops reaching. This is why emptiness works where effort fails. It cannot be controlled, so it cannot be weaponized against yourself. In Buddhist understanding, thoughts are not the problem. Identification is. Trauma strengthens identification by tying thoughts to survival. This thought keeps me safe. This memory protects me. The space between thoughts shows the system that safety is possible without constant vigilance. This is a radical message for a traumatized nervous system. Another reason this space heals is that it restores timing. Trauma disrupts timing. The body reacts now to things that are no longer happening. In the gap between thoughts, there is only now, no past, no future. This reorients the nervous system to present time without needing to explain that the danger is over. It is important to understand that emptiness does not suppress trauma. Suppression tightens the system. Emptiness relaxes it. The difference is crucial. In suppression, there is effort to push away. In emptiness, there is absence of interference. Trauma releases not because it is rejected, but because it is no longer held in place by constant attention. This process is often uneven. Some days the gaps feel accessible. Other days the mind feels crowded. This is not failure. Trauma healing is non-linear because regulation depends on many factors: sleep, stress, environment, relationships. The value of emptiness is that it does not demand consistency. Even brief moments count. The brain rewires through repetition, not intensity. A single long meditation session does less than many small moments of safety throughout the day. Each time you notice a gap and rest there, even for a second, neural pathways shift slightly. Over weeks and months, this adds up. One of the most healing aspects of the space between thoughts is that it returns agency to the body. Trauma often involves loss of control, being trapped, being overwhelmed. In emptiness, nothing is happening to you. You are not being pulled. You are not being pushed. This sense of neutrality restores trust. This trust allows the system to release stored tension gradually. Muscles soften, the jaw unclenches, the gut relaxes. These changes often occur without conscious awareness. People notice later that they feel less reactive, less startled, less exhausted. They may not connect it to emptiness, but emptiness has been doing its work quietly. Another important point is that emptiness does not bypass emotion. Emotions may still arise, but without constant thought feeding them, they pass through more cleanly. Sadness can be felt without turning into despair. Anger can arise without becoming rage. Fear can appear without becoming panic. This is because the space between thoughts breaks the link between sensation and narrative. Trauma narratives are powerful because they give sensations meaning. Meaning keeps them alive. Without narrative, sensations complete themselves naturally. For many people, the idea of not reliving trauma feels impossible. They believe healing requires revisiting the wound. Emptiness challenges this belief gently. It shows that wounds heal when circulation is restored, not when they are picked repeatedly. The space between thoughts is circulation. There is also a dignity in this approach. Trauma often involves violation, being forced, being overwhelmed. Emptiness does not force anything. It respects the body's pace. It allows release only when the system is ready. This restores a sense of sovereignty. As emptiness becomes more familiar, you may notice that thoughts lose urgency. They still appear, but they do not demand immediate response. This reduces hypervigilance. The nervous system no longer treats every thought as a signal. This change affects sleep. Many people with trauma struggle to rest because thoughts keep looping. As the gaps become more accessible, sleep deepens naturally, not because you control your thoughts, but because the system no longer needs to stay alert. The space between thoughts also changes how you relate to triggers. Triggers do not disappear, but the reaction softens. There is more room between stimulus and response. This room is where choice returns, not forced choice, but natural responsiveness. It is important to emphasize that emptiness does not erase the past. It changes the relationship to it. Memory becomes information, not identity. This reduces shame. Trauma often carries shame, even when logically it does not belong. Emptiness dissolves shame by removing the self-narrative that feeds it. Another healing effect is the restoration of curiosity. Trauma narrows attention. The world feels threatening. In emptiness, attention widens gently. Curiosity returns without effort. You notice small things again: light, sound, movement. This re-engages the parasympathetic nervous system, which supports rest and digestion. This approach also avoids re-traumatization. Many trauma survivors are re-traumatized by aggressive healing methods. Emptiness is inherently non-aggressive. It does not dig. It does not demand. It does not pry. It waits. The space between thoughts becomes a refuge, not because it hides pain, but because it does not amplify it. Pain is allowed, but not dramatized. This is profoundly regulating. Over time, you may notice that your sense of self becomes less rigid. You are not constantly defining yourself through what happened. This does not deny the past. It frees the present. The most subtle and powerful shift is this: safety stops being something you search for. It becomes something you touch again and again in small moments. The space between thoughts is always available. You do not need special conditions. You do not need perfect calm. You only need to stop interfering briefly. This is why emptiness is such an effective refuge from trauma. It works at the level trauma lives, the nervous system. It does not require retelling. It does not require explanation. It simply provides a different experience, repeated until it becomes familiar. As these moments accumulate, the system changes its expectations. The world feels less hostile. The body feels less guarded. The mind feels less crowded. This is not dramatic healing. It is quiet healing. And quiet healing lasts. The space between thoughts does not promise transformation. It offers relief. And relief repeated becomes stability. Stability becomes trust. Trust becomes freedom. And all of it begins in places so small, the mind usually ignores them. A pause, a breath, a gap where nothing needs to be done. As the nervous system learns to rest in those quiet gaps, something unexpected can surface. Not panic, not memory, a hollow feeling that does not come from thought, a sense of being alone, even when nothing is wrong. This is often misunderstood and quickly avoided, but this feeling is not a setback, it is an opening. Loneliness is usually treated as a problem to solve, a sign that something is missing, a signal to reach out, distract, or fill the space. But there is a form of loneliness that appears not because connection is absent, but because old forms of connection are dissolving. When the mind stops clinging to noise, identity, usefulness, fixing, and constant thinking, the familiar sense of being someone among others weakens. What remains can feel like isolation. This loneliness is not caused by lack of people. It can arise in relationships, families, crowds. It is not social loneliness. It is existential loneliness, the feeling of standing without reference points, the sense that nothing outside is holding you in place. This can feel deeply uncomfortable because the mind has relied on reflection from others to feel real. From early life, connection is mirrored. You know yourself by how you are seen, by how you are responded to, by how you are named. As emptiness deepens, this mirror loses its authority. You are no longer constantly checking yourself against others, and without that checking, there can be a feeling of floating alone. This is the loneliness many people fear the most. Not the loneliness of being unloved, but the loneliness of being unanchored. The mind interprets this as abandonment. But something else is happening. The boundary between me and not me is thinning, and before unity is felt, separation feels sharper. Buddhist teachings describe this phase as a necessary passage. When identification with roles, stories, and self-images fades, the old sense of belonging collapses. This belonging was based on similarity, comparison, and recognition. It was conditional. Loneliness arises when those conditions no longer organize experience. The instinctive response is to go back, to reattach, to seek validation, intimacy, or distraction. Sometimes this happens, but when loneliness is allowed to be felt without immediate escape, it begins to change character. It stops being about absence and becomes about openness. At first, loneliness feels like a lack of warmth, a quiet ache, a sense that no one truly knows you. But this ache is not asking for company. It is asking for honesty. It is the feeling of being without the usual filters, without the social self, without the performing self, without the reflected self. Non-dual awareness does not begin with connection. It begins with the collapse of separation. Loneliness marks this collapse. It is the experience of being without the usual boundaries, but not yet recognizing what that boundaryless state actually is. It feels empty because the mind has not learned how to perceive wholeness without objects. In this loneliness, the mind often says, "I am alone." But if you look closely, the I making that statement feels less solid. There is loneliness, but it is not clearly owned. It floats. This is important. It shows that loneliness itself is arising within awareness, not defining awareness. As this becomes clearer, something subtle shifts. You notice that loneliness does not require isolation. It can be present even when connection is available. This reveals that the loneliness is not about others. It is about the self losing its central position. The self has been the organizer of experience. It has been the reference point. When that reference weakens, experience feels uncentered. This uncenteredness feels lonely because there is no someone standing in the middle anymore. But this is also the beginning of non-dual awareness. Non-dual awareness means experience without a central owner, seeing without a seer, hearing without a hearer, living without a separate me supervising life. Before this is recognized as freedom, it feels like loss. Loneliness is the emotional tone of that loss. Many spiritual traditions romanticize unity without acknowledging this phase. They talk about oneness as love and bliss. But before love is felt as universal, the mind must pass through the grief of losing its exclusive identity. Loneliness is that grief. This grief does not come from losing others. It comes from losing the idea that connection depends on separation. The mind has believed that to connect, there must be two, me and you, inside and outside. Loneliness arises when this structure loosens, but the deeper connection has not yet been recognized. If loneliness is resisted, the mind rebuilds separation quickly. It clings to roles. It over-identifies with relationships. It creates drama. It creates dependency. All of this restores a sense of self, but at the cost of depth. When loneliness is allowed, something else emerges. As loneliness is felt without story, it reveals space, wide, quiet, unoccupied space. In this space, awareness is no longer focused on being someone. It begins to include everything. Sounds, sensations, emotions, and others appear within the same field. The sense of over here and over there softens. This is not a dramatic realization. It is often subtle and gradual. The loneliness does not disappear instantly. It becomes transparent. You notice that what felt like isolation is actually openness without preference. Nothing is excluded. Nothing is emphasized. This feels strange at first because the mind is used to prioritizing. From this openness, connection is felt differently. It is no longer about closeness between separate selves. It is about shared presence. You feel connected not because someone understands you, but because you are no longer standing apart from experience. Life feels intimate without effort. This is why isolating experiences often precede profound connection. Isolation strips away distractions. It removes social reinforcement. It forces you to meet awareness without mirrors. This can feel bleak, but it clears the way for a deeper recognition. Awareness does not belong to anyone. It is shared. Loneliness also teaches humility. It removes the fantasy of being special. Specialness is a form of separation. When you feel special, you feel alone. When that specialness dissolves, you feel ordinary. And in ordinariness, connection expands. This does not mean relationships stop mattering. They change. You no longer use others to complete yourself. You meet them as expressions of the same life. This removes pressure. It allows genuine intimacy rather than need-based closeness. Another reason loneliness precedes non-dual awareness is that it exposes the false center. The mind has placed itself at the center of experience. Loneliness shakes that center. When the center dissolves, there is no one left to be lonely. Loneliness fades not because connection is found, but because separation is no longer assumed. This shift often comes with a sense of quiet belonging. Not belonging to a group, but belonging to existence. You feel at home without explanation. This feeling is not emotional in the usual sense. It is steady. It does not fluctuate with mood. Before this belonging is felt, the loneliness can feel raw. The mind may interpret it as failure. Something is wrong with me. I am disconnected. But these interpretations come from the old framework. In truth, the system is reorganizing. Loneliness is also a teacher of compassion. When you feel it fully, without blame, you recognize it in others, not as a problem to fix, but as a shared human experience. This recognition softens judgment. It deepens understanding. In non-dual awareness, compassion does not come from trying to be kind. It comes from seeing that there is no real separation. Others' suffering is not separate from your own. Loneliness, when passed through, opens this seeing. There is also a freedom here from needing to be understood. When you no longer rely on reflection, misunderstanding loses its sting. You do not need others to confirm your experience. This makes connection lighter, more playful, less tense. Loneliness can also reveal the limits of language. Words rely on separation. They point from one to another. In non-dual awareness, experience is immediate. Loneliness fades as attention rests in what is happening rather than how it is described. This does not mean silence forever. It means words lose their burden. They become tools rather than lifelines. As loneliness transforms, you may notice that being alone feels different. Solitude becomes nourishing rather than empty. You enjoy presence without feeling cut off. This is a sign that the system has crossed a threshold. The most isolating experiences often remove all supports. They leave you with nothing to lean on. This can feel cruel, but it also removes false anchors. When nothing holds you, you discover that awareness itself does not need support. This discovery is not intellectual, it is felt. You realize you are not inside life looking out. You are life, appearing as this experience. This realization dissolves loneliness at its root. But again, this does not happen by trying to reach non-dual awareness. It happens by staying honest with loneliness, by not rushing to fill it, by letting it open you rather than close you. Loneliness becomes a gateway because it strips away the familiar and leaves the essential. It removes the noise of relationship dynamics and exposes presence itself. This presence is not yours or mine. It is what everything shares. From here, connection is effortless. You feel close without clinging. You care without fear. You are alone without being lonely. This paradox makes sense only when separation has dissolved. The journey through loneliness is not glamorous. It can feel dull, heavy, or empty, but it is honest, and honesty is the doorway. In the end, loneliness does not disappear because you found someone or something. It disappears because the one who felt separate was never as solid as it seemed. And when that is seen, what remains is not isolation, but quiet belonging with all life. As the sense of separation softens and connection no longer depends on mirrors or closeness, something else begins to lose its grip. The inner voice that explains everything. The habit of turning every feeling into a story. The constant need to know why you feel what you feel. What remains is raw emotion without commentary, and this is where a deeper healing quietly unfolds. Most people do not experience emotions directly. They experience the stories about emotions. Sadness becomes a story about loss. Anger becomes a story about injustice. Fear becomes a story about the future. These stories form instantly, often without awareness. They give emotions meaning, context, and identity, but they also trap emotions in time. Emptiness changes this relationship. When emptiness deepens, emotions still arise, but the mind no longer rushes to explain them. The gap between sensation and interpretation widens. In that gap, emotions are felt as movement rather than messages. This changes everything. Healing does not come from understanding emotions better. It comes from letting them complete themselves without being turned into identity. Emotional storytelling is how the self keeps itself alive. Every story says, "This is happening to me. This means something about me. This confirms who I am." Emptiness weakens this reflex. Without a solid self to defend, stories lose urgency. Emotions arise, peak and dissolve without leaving a narrative trail. This can feel disorienting at first. The mind is used to making sense of feelings. It believes meaning equals safety. When meaning drops away, emotions feel exposed. But this exposure is not dangerous. It is honest. And honesty allows emotions to move freely. Emotions are physical events. They are changes in breath, muscle tone, heart rate, and sensation. Storytelling pulls attention away from the body and into abstraction. Emptiness returns attention to sensation. This grounds emotion in the present moment, where it can be processed naturally. Many people fear that without stories, emotions will overwhelm them. In reality, stories are what make emotions overwhelming. Stories extend emotions into the past and future. They replay them. They justify them. They keep them alive. Without stories, emotions have a natural lifespan. This is why emptiness is so effective in healing emotional pain. It does not analyze. It does not fix. It does not interpret. It allows. Allowing is not passive. It is active presence without interference. And interference is what turns pain into suffering. When emotions are felt without narrative, they lose their personal edge. Sadness is just heaviness. Anger is just heat. Fear is just contraction. These sensations are intense but simple. They move, they change, they end. The suffering comes from my sadness, my anger, my fear. Emptiness dissolves the I. This does not mean emotions become meaningless. They still inform action, but they no longer define identity. You can feel anger and still act wisely. You can feel sadness without becoming depressed. You can feel fear without panic. This is emotional maturity that does not require control. One of the biggest shifts here is the end of emotional justification. The mind often uses emotion to prove something. I feel this way because I was wronged. My pain shows I care. My anger means I'm strong. Emptiness removes the need to prove anything. Emotion no longer has to perform. This is deeply relieving to the nervous system. Emotions no longer need to be amplified to be valid. They can be small, they can be brief, they can pass quietly. This reduces emotional fatigue. Another aspect of emotional storytelling is repetition. The same stories are told again and again, reinforcing the same emotional patterns. Emptiness interrupts repetition by removing the storyteller. Without the narrator, there is nothing to repeat. This does not erase memory. It changes how memory is accessed. Memories may arise, but without emotional commentary. They are seen as events that happened, not events that are still happening. This reduces reactivity. In relationships, the end of emotional storytelling changes communication. You stop explaining your feelings as accusations or defenses. You may still share, but without drama. This makes conflict easier to resolve, not because emotions are suppressed, but because they are not weaponized. Emptiness also changes self-talk. The inner dialogue that labels emotions as good or bad quiets. You stop telling yourself how you should feel. This removes internal conflict. Emotion is allowed to be what it is. This allowance does not mean indulgence. Indulgence is another form of storytelling. It feeds emotion with attention and meaning. Allowance is neutral. It does not add fuel. It lets the fire burn out naturally. One of the most healing effects of this process is the end of emotional identity. Many people define themselves by their emotional patterns. I am anxious. I am angry. I am sensitive. Emptiness reveals that these are states, not traits. They come and go. They do not define you. This realization brings freedom. You are no longer trapped in a personality built around emotional habits. You are fluid, responsive, alive. The end of emotional storytelling also reduces shame. Shame thrives on narrative. It needs a story about being wrong or broken. When emotions are felt without story, shame loses its structure. It cannot survive without interpretation. This is especially powerful for emotions that were judged in the past. Anger that was punished. Sadness that was dismissed. Fear that was mocked. Emptiness gives these emotions space without commentary. This heals old wounds without revisiting them. Another important shift is the end of emotional bargaining. The mind often negotiates with emotions. If I feel this, then I'll do that. Once this passes, I'll be okay. Emptiness ends negotiation. Emotion is not a problem to solve. It is an experience to allow. This changes how long emotions last. Negotiation prolongs them. Allowance shortens them. This is not because allowance pushes them away, but because it removes resistance. The body responds quickly to this shift. Tension releases, breath flows. The system recognizes that it does not need to brace itself against emotion. This reduces chronic stress. Another layer of healing is the end of emotional storytelling about others. You stop assuming motives. You stop building narratives about what others think or feel. This reduces misunderstanding. It increases presence. Emptiness also changes how you listen. You hear emotion in others without immediately translating it into threat or obligation. This allows empathy without exhaustion. This process does not make you emotionally flat. It makes you emotionally clear. You feel deeply, but you are not dragged. You are moved, but not consumed. One of the most subtle benefits is emotional trust. You trust that emotions will pass. You do not rush them. You do not fear them. This trust comes from experience, not belief. The mind may still occasionally spin stories. That is natural. The difference is that you notice it sooner. You see the story forming, and you can choose not to feed it. This choice is not forced. It arises from clarity. Over time, emotional life becomes simpler. Not easier, but simpler, less layered, less tangled, more direct. Emptiness does not take emotion away. It takes away the burden of explanation. And without that burden, emotion can be lived rather than managed. This is why healing occurs when emotions are felt without narrative, explanation, or identity. Because the system no longer has to carry the extra weight of meaning-making. It can return to its natural rhythm. In this rhythm, emotions are waves, not walls. They rise, they fall, they leave no trace, and what remains is presence that is steady, spacious, and free. This presence does not deny emotion. It includes it, but it is larger than it. And in that largeness, healing happens quietly, completely, and without story. As emotional stories fall silent and feelings are no longer used to explain who you are, another sensation can suddenly appear. It is not an emotion in the usual sense. It is a feeling of having nothing to stand on, no inner position, no clear reference point. The mind reaches for something familiar and finds nothing. This moment can feel terrifying, and yet it is one of the most important thresholds there is. Groundlessness is not the absence of support in life. It is the absence of psychological footing, the loss of inner structures that once made you feel oriented, beliefs about who you are, assumptions about how life should unfold, narratives that told you where you stood. When these dissolve, the mind feels exposed. It says, "I don't know where I am anymore." And because the mind equates knowing with safety, fear arises. This fear is often mistaken for danger, but groundlessness is not collapse. It is openness without scaffolding. The terror comes from the mind's habit of leaning on certainty, leaning on control, leaning on meaning, leaning on identity. When nothing is available to lean on, the mind panics because it believes it will fall. But what actually happens is different. There is no falling because there is no edge. In Buddhist understanding, groundlessness is not a mistake. It is a direct encounter with reality as it is. Reality does not offer fixed ground. Everything changes, everything moves, everything arises and passes. Psychological ground is a construction built to make this movement tolerable. When that construction dissolves, the mind feels naked. The terror of groundlessness is the terror of not being able to predict yourself. You no longer know how you will feel tomorrow. You no longer know what identity will be relevant. You no longer know what belief will hold. The mind prefers even painful certainty over this openness. This is why people return to old patterns, even after insight. Familiar suffering feels safer than unfamiliar freedom. Groundlessness also threatens the idea of progress. Without a clear inner position, the mind cannot measure where it is. It cannot say, "I am getting better." This can feel deeply unsettling for anyone who has relied on self-development as orientation. When there is no psychological ground, there is no ladder, and without a ladder, the mind does not know how to move. But groundlessness does not mean chaos. It means responsiveness. When you are not anchored to fixed positions, you respond to what is happening rather than reacting from habit. This is a different kind of stability. Not stability from holding still, but stability from flexibility. The terror comes from misunderstanding stability. The mind believes stability means something solid underneath, a belief, a role, a self-concept. But solid things break. They crack under pressure. Groundlessness reveals a different stability, one that does not depend on anything staying the same. This is why people often feel anxiety when psychological ground drops away. Anxiety is the nervous system searching for footing. It scans for threat because threat is familiar. In the absence of threat, the system does not know how to relax. This is not because something is wrong, but because the system has not yet learned that openness can be safe. Groundlessness is often triggered by life events: loss, illness, failure, sudden change, moments where old identities stop working. These events strip away assumptions. They remove the illusion of control. And while this can feel cruel, it is also clarifying. Life shows you that what you were standing on was never solid. When groundlessness appears on the inner path, it can feel even more intense. You may feel like you are dissolving, like you no longer recognize yourself, like your old motivations no longer apply. This can bring grief, grief for the self you thought you were, grief for the certainty you once had. This grief is not weakness, it is honesty. The mind often tries to resolve groundlessness by rebuilding ground quickly. It grabs onto new beliefs, new spiritual identities, new philosophies, new explanations. This is natural. The mind wants relief, but every time new ground is built, it eventually dissolves too. This cycle repeats until the mind becomes exhausted with rebuilding. Exhaustion is an ally here. When the mind is too tired to construct another identity, groundlessness can be stayed with, not analyzed, not fixed, simply endured. And in this endurance, something unexpected happens. The fear does not destroy you, the openness does not swallow you, life continues. This is when the deeper freedom reveals itself. You begin to see that groundlessness does not remove functioning. You still make decisions, you still respond, you still care. What disappears is the belief that you must stand on something in order to live. True stability is not about holding a position, it is about not needing one. When you stop requiring inner certainty, you stop fighting uncertainty. This reduces friction. Life flows with less resistance. Groundlessness also ends in a rigidity. Without a fixed ground, you are less defensive. You do not need to protect an image. You do not need to defend a belief. This makes interaction lighter. Conflict loses its charge. You can listen without preparing a stance. Another hidden freedom in groundlessness is creativity. When you are not anchored to who you are, new responses become possible. You are not limited by past definitions. You can act freshly. This freshness is stability in motion. Groundlessness also exposes how much fear was generated by trying to be secure. The constant effort to feel safe creates tension. When you stop trying to secure yourself psychologically, that tension dissolves. The nervous system begins to trust adaptability rather than control. From a Buddhist view, this is closely related to impermanence. Everything changes. When you align with this truth, you stop fighting it. Groundlessness is alignment with impermanence at the psychological level. It feels terrifying because it removes the fantasy of permanence. But once that fantasy is gone, you stop being disappointed by change. The freedom concealed in groundlessness is the freedom from self-definition. You are no longer bound by past decisions or future expectations. You can respond to life as it unfolds. This responsiveness is intelligent, it is sensitive, it is not random. Groundlessness also heals shame. Shame relies on a fixed self that can be judged. When the self is seen as fluid, shame loses its anchor. You still learn from mistakes, but without self-condemnation. Another aspect of freedom here is trust. Not blind trust, but lived trust. Trust that you can meet what arises. Trust that you do not need to know everything in advance. Trust that awareness itself is sufficient. This trust grows slowly. Each time you face groundlessness and survive, confidence builds. Not confidence in identity, but confidence in presence. You learn that you can stand without standing on anything. Groundlessness also reduces fear of failure. Failure requires a fixed goal and a fixed self. When both loosen, failure becomes information rather than judgment. This encourages experimentation and honesty. In relationships, groundlessness allows authenticity. You are not performing a role, you are responding as you are. This can feel vulnerable, but it also creates real connection. Others feel your presence rather than your position. The mind may still seek ground from time to time. That is natural. The difference is that you see it happening. You do not mistake ground for truth anymore. You recognize it as a temporary support. Eventually, groundlessness stops feeling like free fall and starts feeling like standing in open space. There is no pressure from below, no need to brace. You are supported by nothing, and yet you are not unsupported. This paradox is central. True stability does not come from certainty. It comes from adaptability, from being at ease with not knowing, from trusting the movement of life rather than resisting it. The terror of groundlessness hides this truth because the mind equates safety with solidity, but solidity is fragile, openness is resilient. When you no longer require psychological footing, life stops feeling like a test. You stop trying to get it right. You live it. This is stability that does not shake when conditions change. Groundlessness is not the end of the path. It is the doorway. A doorway to a life that is less defended, less rigid, and more alive. And once you pass through, you realize something simple and profound. You were never meant to stand on something. You were meant to move with everything. As the mind learns to stand without footing and discovers that openness does not destroy it, another challenge quietly takes shape. It is not fear this time. It is not panic. It is a dull, unsettling sense that something important has drained away. The drive that once pushed you forward fades, and what replaces it feels empty in a way that does not yet feel free. This is the phase where many turn back, believing something has gone wrong. When familiar goals lose their pull, the mind often labels the experience as meaninglessness. Purpose used to organize life. It gave direction, urgency, and identity. You knew what you were moving toward. You knew why you woke up in the morning. When emptiness deepens, these structures dissolve, not violently, but quietly. And quiet dissolutions are easy to misinterpret. Meaninglessness is frightening because it feels like stagnation. The mind says, if nothing matters, why do anything? This thought can feel heavy, draining, almost depressive, but this is not the end state. It is a transition. Meaning is dissolving because it was built on assumptions that no longer hold. Most meaning is borrowed. It comes from culture, family, achievement, comparison, and expectation. You were taught what should matter long before you had the chance to discover what actually does. Emptiness strips away borrowed meaning first. This creates a vacuum, and the mind assumes the vacuum is permanent. The problem is not that life has no meaning. The problem is that the old meaning was conditional. It depended on outcomes, on becoming, on arriving somewhere. When emptiness removes the sense of a separate self striving toward a future, those conditions collapse. Meaning based on I will be someone no longer works. This collapse can feel bleak. You may still function, but without enthusiasm. You may go through motions without conviction. The mind worries that this flatness is the price of awakening. It is not. It is simply the nervous system adjusting to the absence of familiar motivation. Purpose was often fueled by lack. You move forward because something felt missing. When emptiness reveals that nothing is missing in the way you thought, the fuel disappears. But the mind has not yet discovered a new source of movement, so it calls the pause meaningless. This is similar to what happens when someone leaves a long-held belief system. At first, there is confusion. Old answers no longer satisfy, but new understanding has not yet matured. The space between beliefs feels empty and unsettling. Emptiness works the same way, but at a deeper level. Wisdom does not arrive fully formed. It grows out of not knowing. But modern culture rarely respects not knowing. It pushes for answers, clarity, direction. So when emptiness introduces ambiguity, the mind judges it harshly. The feeling of meaninglessness is often intensified by comparison. Others seem driven, others seem passionate. You may wonder why you feel detached. This comparison is painful because it assumes something is wrong. But what is happening is a reorganization of values at the deepest level. When purpose dissolves, the ego loses one of its main supports. Purpose gave the ego relevance. I am the one doing this. I matter because of my mission. Without that narrative, the ego feels erased. It interprets this erasure as emptiness without value. But there is a difference between meaninglessness and meaning-free. Meaninglessness is the belief that nothing matters. Meaning-free is the experience of life without imposed significance. The first is despair. The second is openness. The transition between them can be confusing because both feel empty. Emptiness feels meaningless before it feels peaceful, because the mind is still searching for replacement meaning. It is still oriented toward purpose as an object. It asks, what should matter now? But emptiness does not answer that question. It dissolves the question itself. At first, this can feel like drifting. You may feel less ambition, less urgency, less desire to prove yourself. This is often mistaken for apathy. But apathy is numbness. This is different. Sensitivity remains, care remains. What fades is compulsive striving. Another reason this phase feels difficult is that many people tie their identity to contribution. When contribution no longer defines you, you may feel unnecessary. This connects to earlier layers of being unneeded. But here it goes deeper. It is not just about usefulness. It is about existential relevance. The mind asks, if I am not becoming something, what am I here for? This question can echo painfully, but notice that the question assumes life requires justification. Emptiness gently challenges this assumption. In Buddhist understanding, this phase is often described as the fading of craving. Craving does not only apply to pleasure, it also applies to meaning. The craving for a meaningful life can be just as binding as craving for success. When this craving weakens, the mind feels lost because it no longer knows what to chase. This loss is temporary. It is the clearing of ground, not the final landscape. Wisdom does not replace purpose immediately. It emerges gradually as a different way of relating to life. Wisdom is not a goal, it is a way of seeing. It does not tell you what to do, it informs how you do whatever arises. This takes time to mature, and while it matures, the mind may feel like it is wandering without direction. One of the most important things to understand here is that peace is not motivating in the same way purpose is. Purpose pulls, peace settles. The nervous system needs time to learn how to move from settling rather than pulling. Until it learns, life can feel strangely flat. This flatness is not emptiness gone wrong. It is emptiness before joy. Joy that is not dependent on meaning, achievement, or narrative. Joy that arises from being present rather than becoming someone. Another layer of discomfort comes from social pressure. Society rewards purpose. It praises ambition. It asks, what do you do? When your inner life no longer revolves around doing, these questions feel awkward. You may feel disconnected from common conversations. This can reinforce the sense of meaninglessness. But as this phase deepens, something subtle begins to shift. You notice moments of quiet satisfaction that do not relate to goals. A simple task feels complete without evaluation. A moment of rest feels full without explanation. These moments are easy to dismiss because they do not fit old definitions of meaning. Over time, these moments accumulate. The nervous system begins to recognize a different form of fulfillment. Not excitement, not purpose-driven satisfaction, a calm sense of rightness. This is the beginning of peace. Peace does not announce itself. It does not come with fireworks. It feels ordinary. This ordinariness can be confusing for a mind trained to associate meaning with intensity. But peace is stable because it does not depend on conditions. Wisdom emerges quietly from this stability. Wisdom is the ability to respond appropriately without needing a narrative. It does not tell you what matters. It reveals what does not matter. And by removing what does not matter, it clarifies action naturally. When wisdom begins to emerge, meaning returns, but in a different form. It is no longer abstract. It is lived. Meaning is found in presence, not purpose. In care, not accomplishment. In attention, not achievement. This meaning does not demand sacrifice. It does not require urgency. It does not depend on outcome. It feels grounded even without ground. The mind often resists this because it seems too simple. That can't be it, it says. There must be more. This resistance comes from old conditioning. Emptiness does not promise more. It reveals enough. Another reason emptiness feels meaningless before peaceful is that peace does not excite the ego. The ego wants drama, progress, identity. Peace offers none of these. It offers rest. And rest can feel boring to a system addicted to striving, but boredom here is not lack. It is withdrawal from stimulation. As the system detoxes, sensitivity returns. Colors become sharper, sounds become clearer, presence deepens. This is not numbness, it is refinement. The transitional phase is often marked by doubt. Did I lose my motivation? Am I becoming passive? Is this a mistake? These questions are part of the shedding process. They are old voices trying to reassert relevance. It helps to see that meaninglessness is not a dead end. It is a threshold between borrowed meaning and intrinsic meaning. Borrowed meaning collapses quickly. Intrinsic meaning grows slowly. Intrinsic meaning is not something you find. It is something that reveals itself when you stop forcing life to be significant. It is felt in simple acts done fully, in listening without agenda, in resting without guilt. As wisdom deepens, action returns naturally. You do things not because they give your life meaning, but because they are what the moment calls for. This removes inner conflict. You are no longer torn between what you want and what you should want. Peace then stops feeling passive and starts feeling alive, not energized but engaged. You are present with what is happening without needing it to justify your existence. This is why emptiness feels like meaninglessness before it feels like peace. The old engine shuts down before the new rhythm is felt. The pause between them can feel uncomfortable, even frightening. But if you stay, if you do not rush to rebuild purpose, something wiser takes shape. Life begins to guide action without mental force. Values become embodied rather than conceptual. You do not think about meaning, you live it. In this way, wisdom emerges not as an answer, but as clarity. Not as purpose, but as presence. And presence turns out to be enough. The mind eventually realizes that peace was not the absence of meaning. It was freedom from needing it. As peace begins to replace the hunger for meaning, another quiet unease often surfaces. It does not shout. It does not panic. It simply whispers, "I don't know who I am anymore." This whisper can feel deeply unsettling, especially in a world that constantly asks you to define yourself. Yet this moment is not a breakdown. It is an opening. Not knowing who you are feels uncomfortable because identity has been your map. It told you how to act, what to value, and where you belonged. When purpose dissolved, identity often went with it. Roles that once felt natural now feel thin. Labels that once fit feel loose. The mind looks for something solid to point to and finds only space. This is often mistaken for a personal crisis. Identity confusion is usually framed as something to fix quickly. Choose a direction, pick a label, commit to a version of yourself. But this urgency comes from fear, not wisdom. The fear that without an identity, you will disappear. The fear that others will not know how to relate to you. The fear that life requires a clear definition to function. What is rarely acknowledged is that identity has always been provisional. It changed with age, context, relationships, and circumstances. The difference now is that you are aware of this fluidity. Awareness removes the comfort of pretending that identity was ever permanent. This honesty can feel destabilizing. The discomfort of not knowing who you are arises because the mind has been trained to treat identity as safety. When you know who you are, you know how to behave. When you know how to behave, you feel protected. Not knowing removes that script. You must respond freshly rather than automatically. This feels risky, but this risk is also sacred. It is sacred because it invites authenticity. Without a fixed identity, you cannot hide behind roles. You cannot perform a version of yourself. You must meet life as it is, moment by moment. In Buddhist understanding, the self is not denied, but it is seen as empty of fixed essence. This does not mean you do not exist. It means you exist as process, not as object. Identity confusion is the mind catching up to this truth. It is the gap between losing old definitions and not yet needing new ones. This gap feels uncomfortable because it is unstructured. The mind loves structure. It loves knowing where it stands. In this interval, there is no clear position. You may feel transparent, exposed, undefined. These sensations can trigger anxiety because the mind equates definition with protection. Yet something remarkable happens when you do not rush to resolve this discomfort. The nervous system begins to relax into not knowing. It learns that uncertainty does not equal danger. This learning cannot happen if identity is rebuilt too quickly. The sacredness of this interval lies in its openness. You are no longer limited by past descriptions. You are not constrained by expectations you once accepted. You are free to respond rather than conform. This freedom does not feel empowering at first. It feels empty. The mind may try to fill this emptiness with new identities, spiritual identities, healing identities, identities built around insight or awakening. These are subtle traps. They feel refined, but they still function as defenses. They restore certainty at the cost of openness. Staying in not knowing requires courage. Not dramatic courage, but quiet endurance. The willingness to let questions remain unanswered. The willingness to let others misunderstand you. The willingness to not explain yourself fully. This willingness softens the grip of self-image. You stop trying to manage how you appear. You stop rehearsing who you are supposed to be. This reduces inner tension dramatically. Much of mental strain comes from maintaining consistency. When that maintenance drops, energy returns. Identity confusion also changes how you listen. Without a fixed self to defend, you hear more clearly. You are less reactive. You are not filtering everything through, "What does this say about me?" This deepens presence. Another gift of this interval is humility. Without a clear identity, you are less certain. This uncertainty opens curiosity. You are more open to learning, more open to being wrong, more open to change. This humility is not self-doubt. It is flexibility. It allows growth without self-violence. You are no longer forcing yourself into shapes that do not fit. The discomfort can still be intense, especially in social situations. When asked to describe yourself, you may hesitate. Old answers feel false. New answers feel premature. Silence feels awkward. This awkwardness is part of the shedding process. Society often treats identity confusion as immaturity, as something that should have been resolved earlier. This creates shame, but from a contemplative perspective, this confusion is a sign of depth. It means you are no longer satisfied with surface definitions. Identity confusion also reveals how much of your sense of self came from contrast. You knew who you were by knowing who you were not. Emptiness dissolves this contrast. Without comparison, identity loses shape. This loss of shape allows compassion to grow. When you no longer define yourself rigidly, you stop defining others rigidly. You see people as processes, not categories. This softens judgment. The sacred interval of not knowing also heals perfectionism. Perfectionism relies on a fixed ideal self. When identity is fluid, ideals lose authority. You stop measuring yourself against imaginary standards. This does not mean you stop caring. It means care becomes contextual rather than absolute. You respond to what is needed rather than what fits an image. Another subtle shift occurs around memory. You stop using the past as a reference point for who you are. Memories remain, but they are no longer evidence. This frees you from repeating old roles. Future planning also changes. You still plan, but without using plans to define yourself. Plans become practical rather than existential. This reduces anxiety about getting life right. The sacredness of this interval is often overlooked because it does not look productive. Nothing is being built, nothing is being achieved, but something essential is happening. The system is recalibrating. Identity confusion is like soil resting between crops. It looks empty, but it is restoring nutrients. If you rush to plant something new too quickly, the soil weakens. If you allow rest, future growth is healthier. This interval also reveals how much identity was tied to pain. Many people unknowingly organize their sense of self around wounds. I am the one who suffered. I am the one who survived. When identity loosens, these stories lose centrality. This can feel like losing legitimacy, but it also frees energy. Not knowing who you are allows pain to be part of experience rather than the core of identity. This is deeply healing. There is also a quiet joy hidden here. Without a fixed identity, moments are experienced more directly. You laugh without wondering what it says about you. You cry without labeling yourself emotional. You act without self-consciousness. This simplicity feels fresh. The mind may still try to resolve the interval by asking, so who am I really? This question assumes there is a final answer. Buddhist insight suggests there is not. There is only ongoing appearance. When this is seen, the question relaxes. You stop needing an answer. Life becomes the answer, moment by moment. Identity confusion becomes sacred when it is honored rather than rushed, when you see it as a rite of passage rather than a flaw. Many spiritual traditions recognize this phase as essential. It strips away false certainty so deeper truth can emerge. This truth is not an identity. It is presence. Presence does not need definition. It is what allows definitions to appear and disappear. As this becomes clearer, discomfort softens. Not knowing becomes tolerable, then neutral, then freeing. You realize you can function without a clear self-image. You can relate without a script. You can live without a label. This does not make you vague, it makes you responsive. You become who the moment requires, without internal conflict. The sacred interval eventually reveals that identity was never something you had to find. It was something you were constantly recreating. When recreation stops, what remains is awareness itself. This awareness is not confused. It does not ask who it is. It simply is. And resting here, even briefly, brings a deep sense of relief. The discomfort of not knowing who you are fades when you see that not knowing is not absence, it is openness, it is life before it is named, and in that unnamed space, something essential is finally allowed to breathe. As the need to define yourself loosens and identity no longer demands an answer, another habit quietly loses its fuel. The constant measuring, the silent scanning of others' lives, the background question of, how do I compare? When the self is no longer solid, comparison begins to fall apart. And with it, a deep and often lifelong source of suffering starts to dissolve. Chronic comparison is exhausting because it never ends. There is always someone ahead, someone behind, someone doing better, someone doing worse. The mind treats life like a scoreboard. Even when nothing is wrong, it searches for ranking. This habit does not come from arrogance or insecurity alone. It comes from self-reference. The belief that there is a fixed me whose value must be located in relation to others. When identity confusion becomes tolerable, self-reference weakens. You are no longer constantly asking, who am I? And because of that, the next question, how do I measure up, loses urgency. Comparison needs a stable self to compare. Emptiness removes that stability. Envy is not about wanting what others have. It is about wanting to be someone else. It arises when the mind believes identity is limited. When someone else appears happier, more successful, more fulfilled, the mind assumes they possess something you lack. This assumption depends on the idea that happiness, success, or worth are objects that can be owned. Emptiness reveals that experience is not owned. It arises. It passes. No one possesses a permanent advantage. This insight does not come from positive thinking. It comes from seeing how unstable identity actually is. Chronic comparison is reinforced by stories. Stories about progress, stories about timelines, stories about where you should be by now. These stories are internalized early and rarely questioned. Emptiness interrupts storytelling by dissolving the narrator. Without a strong narrator, stories lose momentum. The collapse of self-reference means there is no central point from which to compare. Experience still happens. You still see others' achievements or struggles, but they no longer translate into personal judgment. You notice without internal commentary. This does not make you indifferent. It makes you clear. You can appreciate others without diminishing yourself. You can acknowledge difference without turning it into hierarchy. One of the most painful aspects of comparison is inadequacy. The sense that you are behind, that you missed something, that others figured life out and you did not. This pain is rooted in a false timeline. The mind assumes there is a correct pace for becoming someone. Emptiness removes the idea of becoming someone. Without that project, there is no timeline to fall behind on. Life is no longer a race toward an imagined finish line. It is a series of unfolding moments. This shift brings relief, not excitement, but relief. The nervous system stops bracing against imagined standards. The background tension of not enough softens. Comparison also thrives on visibility. Social exposure magnifies it. You see curated lives and assume completeness. Emptiness changes how perception works. You see appearances without believing them. You recognize that what is shown is partial, contextual, and fleeting. More importantly, you stop using others as mirrors. Without a fixed self-image, you no longer need reflection to know who you are. This removes the reflex to scan others for clues about your own worth. From a Buddhist perspective, comparison is rooted in ignorance of emptiness. Ignorance here does not mean stupidity. It means misperception. The belief that there is a separate self that can be improved, ranked, or perfected. When this belief collapses, comparison collapses with it. This collapse is not an act of will. You cannot decide to stop comparing. Trying to stop comparison is just another comparison. Emptiness works because it removes the structure that comparison depends on. Another important aspect is the end of internal competition. Many people compete with themselves constantly. They compare their present self to an imagined ideal. This internal comparison is just as draining as external comparison. When self-reference dissolves, the ideal self loses authority. You no longer measure yourself against who you think you should be. This reduces self-criticism dramatically. The end of chronic comparison also changes motivation. Without comparison, you may fear losing drive, but what actually happens is a shift in energy. Motivation becomes intrinsic. You do things because they matter to the moment, not because they improve your rank. This intrinsic motivation is sustainable. It does not depend on outperforming others. It does not require constant validation. It feels quieter, but more stable. Emptiness also heals comparison by revealing shared humanity. When identity is fluid, differences feel less absolute. You see others as variations of the same process. This reduces envy and increases empathy. Another subtle effect is gratitude without contrast. Gratitude no longer depends on being better off than someone else. It arises from direct experience. This form of gratitude is not moral. It is natural. Inadequacy often hides behind achievement. People overwork, overachieve, and overperform to escape comparison. Emptiness removes the need for escape. You are no longer running from a sense of lack, because lack is seen as a construct. This does not make you passive, it makes you honest. You can acknowledge strengths and limitations without turning them into identity. You can grow without self-rejection. Comparison also fuels anxiety, the fear of falling behind, the fear of missing out. Emptiness calms this fear by removing the reference point. There is no behind, there is only now. This now-centeredness is not forced mindfulness. It is a natural outcome of reduced self-reference. Attention rests where experience is happening rather than where judgment is forming. Another important healing here is the end of resentment. Comparison often leads to resentment toward those who appear to have more. When comparison dissolves, resentment has nowhere to land. Others' success no longer feels like your failure. This allows genuine celebration. You can be happy for others without bitterness. This is a sign that comparison has lost its grip. Emptiness also changes how you handle feedback. Praise and criticism lose their power. They become information rather than verdicts. This protects emotional balance. The collapse of self-reference also ends the habit of constant self-improvement for status. You may still refine skills or learn new things, but without using them to prove worth. This removes pressure and restores joy in learning. Another layer of freedom is privacy. Without comparison, you feel less need to display your life. You stop curating yourself. This reduces anxiety and increases authenticity. Comparison often masks fear of insignificance. Emptiness heals this by revealing that significance is not required. Existence does not need to be justified by standing out. This realization can feel humbling at first, but humility here is relief. You are no longer carrying the burden of being exceptional. Over time, the absence of comparison creates a stable sense of enoughness, not complacency, enoughness. You recognize that your life does not need to compete to be valid. This enoughness is quiet. It does not seek confirmation. It does not need agreement. It simply is. The end of chronic comparison also changes how you experience success. Success becomes situational rather than personal. You succeed at a task, not at being someone. This reduces attachment and fear of loss. Failure also changes. Without comparison, failure is not humiliation. It is feedback. This encourages resilience. Emptiness as the cure for comparison works because it removes the measuring stick. Without a stick, nothing is tall or short. Things simply are. This does not flatten life, it clarifies it. Differences remain, but hierarchy dissolves. Diversity is seen without ranking. As self-reference continues to dissolve, envy becomes rare. When it does appear, it is noticed quickly and allowed to pass without judgment. It no longer defines you. Inadequacy fades because there is no longer an imagined standard to fail. You are no longer comparing a real life to an idealized one. The freedom here is subtle but profound. You stop living against others. You start living with life. Emptiness does not make you superior to comparison. It makes comparison irrelevant. And in that irrelevance, a deep peace takes root. You realize that you were never behind. You were never ahead. You were always here, and here turns out to be enough. As comparison fades and you stop measuring your life against others, something even more basic begins to quiet down. The constant reaching, the inner leaning toward more, the quiet itch that says, "Not yet." You may notice moments where the wanting simply stops, not because you forced it, but because it has nothing left to grab. And in that stopping, a different kind of happiness becomes visible. Desire is often treated as life's engine. People say desire is what keeps you moving, what gives you ambition, what makes you human. But much of what is called desire is not aliveness, it is restlessness. It is the mind's habit of using the future to escape the present. Desire says, when I get that, I'll finally feel okay. It promises relief, not just pleasure, and that promise is why it has so much power. When emptiness deepens, the mind begins to see this pattern clearly. It notices that the thrill of getting what you want is brief. The mind then quickly creates a new want. The satisfaction does not last because the mechanism is not designed to end. Desire keeps itself alive by continuously moving the finish line. This is why wanting can feel like hunger even when your life is full. You can have relationships, stability, comfort, and still feel something missing. That missing feeling is not always about your circumstances. It is the habit of wanting itself. The mind has learned to interpret openness as lack. So when there is space, it fills it with desire. Emptiness changes this by showing you the difference between true needs and compulsive wanting. Needs are simple. They arise, they are met, they settle. Wanting is endless. It feeds on fantasy. It is rarely satisfied because it does not want the object. It wants the feeling it believes the object will create. This is where desire begins to fall silent. You start noticing the moment before wanting forms, a subtle tightening, a leaning, a story about the future. When you see this early, you are no longer fully captured. The wanting may still arise, but it is not authoritative. It becomes a movement in awareness rather than a command. Desire falls silent not by suppression, but by exposure. When you see how it works, it loses its charm. It is like seeing the strings behind a magic trick. The trick may still be performed, but it no longer hypnotizes you. This shift can feel strange at first. If desire has been your main motivator, its quieting can feel like emptiness in the negative sense. You may worry you will lose interest in life, but what actually happens is a purification of motivation. Compulsive wanting fades and natural preferences remain. Preferences are different from craving. Preferences are light. You like something, you choose it, you enjoy it, and you can let it go. Craving is heavy. It says you need something to feel complete. Emptiness reveals that completeness is not produced by objects. It is uncovered when craving relaxes. This is the heart of Buddhist teaching on desire. Buddhism does not claim that all desire is evil. It points to craving, the kind of desire that creates suffering because it insists that experience must be different for you to be okay. Emptiness softens this insistence. When desire begins to fall silent, happiness changes form. Many people think happiness is excitement, achievement, or pleasure. Those are forms of stimulation. They rise and fall. The happiness revealed in emptiness is quieter. It feels like ease, like enoughness, like not being chased by the next thing. This happiness does not depend on getting something. It depends on not fighting what is already here. It emerges naturally when the mind stops using the future as an escape. The mind is often shocked by this. It expects happiness to feel like a reward, but the happiness of emptiness feels more like relief. The relief of not needing to become something, the relief of not needing to chase, the relief of not being at war with the present. There is also an important nervous system shift here. Craving keeps the system activated. It creates low-grade stress because the mind is always scanning for improvement. When wanting quiets, the body relaxes. Breath deepens. Muscles soften. The system stops bracing. This physiological ease is part of the happiness emptiness reveals. Another aspect of desire is identity. Many wants are not about the object, but about the self-image attached to it. Wanting success, status, beauty, recognition, or even spiritual progress is often wanting a different identity. When identity has already loosened through emptiness, desire loses one of its main roots. You no longer need the object to be someone, so the object loses its emotional charge. You may still pursue goals, but with less desperation. This makes action cleaner and more effective. Desire also feeds on stories of deficiency. I'm behind. I'm not enough. I need to improve. When comparison collapses, these deficiency stories weaken. Desire has less to feed on. This is why the lessons connect. The end of comparison prepares the end of craving. But desire has deeper layers. Even after external desires soften, there can be subtler wanting. Wanting peace, wanting awakening, wanting to never feel pain again. These desires can be more deceptive because they sound noble. Yet they still carry the same structure. I am not okay now, but I will be okay later. Emptiness reveals this structure gently. It shows that even the desire for peace can become a source of unrest if it is used to reject the present. True peace is not achieved by wanting it. It is revealed by releasing the demand for experience to change. This does not mean you stop growing. It means growth is no longer a rejection of now. You can learn and evolve without treating the current moment as a problem. When desire falls silent, the senses become clearer. Craving dulls perception because it is always looking past the present. It uses the present as a stepping stone. Without craving, the present is fully tasted. Food tastes richer, music feels deeper, a simple walk feels complete. This is not because life changed, but because attention returned. This is a kind of happiness many people have forgotten. They live in pursuit and miss the texture of actual experience. Emptiness restores texture. Another shift is contentment without complacency. Contentment means you are at ease with what is. Complacency means you do not care. The mind often confuses the two because it equates caring with craving. But you can care without craving. You can act from love rather than lack. This is a crucial point. When wanting quiets, love becomes clearer. Many people confuse love with need. They love in a tight way, holding, demanding, fearing loss. Emptiness softens this. Love becomes spacious. It does not need possession. It does not need constant reassurance. This is happiness too, a happiness that comes from connection without craving. Desire also affects time. Craving pulls you into the future. Regret pulls you into the past. When craving quiets, time feels less heavy. The present becomes less of a tunnel and more of a home. This is not mystical. It is a shift in attention. The mind may still produce wants, especially under stress. This is normal. Emptiness does not eliminate desire permanently. It changes your relationship to it. You no longer take every want as truth. You can let a desire arise and pass without obeying it. This is freedom. Not the freedom to get everything you want, but the freedom from being controlled by wanting. This freedom is more valuable than any object because it cannot be taken away by circumstances. Another subtle aspect is gratitude without grasping. You appreciate what you have without needing it to guarantee happiness. This reduces fear of loss. Fear of loss is a major driver of desire. The mind wants to secure good feelings by securing objects. Emptiness reveals that security does not come from possession. It comes from non-clinging. This does not mean you stop enjoying comfort or beauty. It means enjoyment becomes lighter. You can enjoy without fear. You can lose without collapse. This is deep happiness. In Buddhist language, this is the movement from craving to equanimity. Equanimity is not coldness. It is balance. It is the ability to experience pleasure and pain without being thrown. When desire falls silent, equanimity becomes possible. This silence is not forced silence. It is a natural quieting that happens when the mind sees the cost of craving. Craving is expensive. It costs peace. It costs presence. It costs satisfaction. Once this is seen, the mind begins to let go. And in letting go, happiness appears not as a prize, but as what was there underneath the reaching, like a calm lake revealed when wind stops. The space where desire falls silent is not empty of life. It is full of life without hunger, full without needing more. This fullness is not excitement, it is quiet richness. This is why emptiness reveals happiness that does not arise from wanting, because wanting was never the source of happiness. Wanting was the movement away from it. When wanting ends, even briefly, you taste something the world rarely talks about. Happiness without pursuit, peace without achievement. A simple sense that this moment is enough. And once you taste it, the old chase begins to look less convincing. Not because you became detached, but because you finally met the kind of happiness that does not disappear the moment you get what you want. As desire quiets and happiness no longer depends on chasing, something unexpected can arise. Instead of relief, there may be resistance, a subtle unease when nothing is pulling you forward, a discomfort when there is nothing to fix, nothing to want, nothing to pursue. You finally have space to rest, and the mind does not trust it. The mind fears rest more than pain because pain is familiar. Pain gives the self something to hold on to. It provides structure, identity, and movement. Rest removes all three. When the mind rests, it loses its job, and a mind without a job feels threatened. For many people, suffering has become a home, not because they enjoy it, but because it is known. Anxiety, worry, overthinking, and self-criticism create a constant hum. That hum defines the sense of self. I am the one who struggles. I am the one who worries. I am the one who tries. When rest appears, this identity has nowhere to stand. Stillness feels dangerous because it interrupts habitual suffering patterns. These patterns are not random. They are rehearsed, repeated, reinforced over years. The nervous system has learned to stay activated. It equates activation with safety. Rest feels like letting your guard down in a world that taught you to stay alert. Pain keeps the system engaged. It creates urgency. It gives meaning to effort. Rest does the opposite. It asks nothing. It does not flatter the ego. It does not confirm the self-story. In rest, there is no struggle to prove worth. And this can feel like erasure. The mind often prefers pain because pain confirms existence. I hurt, therefore I am. This may sound extreme, but at a deep level, discomfort reassures the mind that it is alive and relevant. Rest threatens this relevance. It feels like fading. This is why people often sabotage rest. They sit down and suddenly remember something urgent. They lie in bed and their mind races. They take a break and feel guilty. These are not accidents. They are defense mechanisms. The mind is protecting its identity. From a Buddhist perspective, this is clinging to suffering. Not because suffering is pleasant, but because it is known. The self has been built around effort, tension, and striving. Stillness threatens to dissolve that construction. Rest also removes distraction. Without activity, the mind cannot avoid itself. This can bring up unresolved feelings, but more often it brings up something more unsettling. Nothing, no drama, no problem, just being. And the mind does not know how to relate to that. The fear of rest is not the fear of boredom, it is the fear of losing narrative. In rest, the story pauses. There is no progress, no regression, no commentary. The self, which depends on narrative continuity, feels interrupted. Pain keeps the story going. I am struggling, therefore the story continues. Rest pauses the story, and a paused story feels like an ending to the mind, even when it is not. This is why many people feel anxious when things finally settle. They resolve one problem, and immediately another appears. The mind does not know how to exist without friction. Friction has been mistaken for aliveness. Stillness threatens habitual suffering because suffering has been personalized. It is not just something that happens, it is something you do. You worry, you replay, you criticize. These actions create a sense of agency. Rest removes agency, it removes doing, and without doing, the ego feels useless. The irony is that rest is what the system actually needs to heal. Chronic activation exhausts the nervous system. It keeps stress hormones elevated. It prevents deep repair. Yet the mind resists rest because it feels like giving up control. Control is another key factor. Pain gives the illusion of control. If you are worrying, at least you are doing something. If you are planning, at least you are preparing. Rest feels like surrender, and surrender feels like danger to a system trained to survive through vigilance. This is why rest can trigger fear responses. Heart rate may increase, thoughts may accelerate. The body interprets stillness as vulnerability. This is not logical, it is conditioned. Habitual suffering patterns also provide predictability. Even painful predictability feels safer than unknown peace. The mind knows how to operate within suffering. It knows what to expect. Peace is unfamiliar territory. When emptiness deepens and desire falls silent, rest becomes possible. But the first encounters with rest often feel uncomfortable. The mind searches for stimulation. It creates noise. It invents problems. This is the mind trying to re-establish familiar ground. Stillness also threatens the belief that you must earn rest. Many people were taught that rest is a reward. You rest after working hard. You relax after achieving. When emptiness removes the chase, rest appears without justification. This feels wrong to the conditioned mind. Guilt often arises here. I shouldn't be resting. I haven't done enough. This guilt is not moral. It is structural. It is the ego's response to losing its role. Without striving, the ego feels unnecessary. Pain, on the other hand, feels earned. It justifies existence. I suffer, therefore I deserve to be here. This is a deep and often unconscious belief. Rest challenges it by saying, you can exist without suffering. This is a radical message to a system built on effort. Stillness also removes distraction from bodily sensations. In rest, you feel the body more clearly. Tension becomes obvious. Fatigue becomes noticeable. This can feel uncomfortable at first, but this discomfort is information, not danger. It is the body asking for care. The mind often misinterprets this signal and says, rest is bad. I feel worse when I stop. In reality, stopping reveals what was already there. Movement was masking it. Another reason the mind fears rest is that rest reveals impermanence. In stillness, thoughts come and go. Emotions arise and fade. There is no stable center. This can feel destabilizing. Pain, in contrast, feels solid. It gives the illusion of permanence. The self often defines itself through struggle. I am strong because I endure. I am valuable because I try. Rest threatens these narratives. It asks, who are you without effort? This question can feel confronting, yet this question is also liberating. Without effort, you are not reduced, you are revealed. Awareness remains, presence remains, life continues. The mind fears rest because rest exposes how unnecessary much suffering was. This realization can bring grief, grief for wasted energy, grief for years spent fighting. The mind avoids rest to avoid this grief, but when grief is allowed, it passes. And what remains is softness, compassion for yourself, understanding. Stillness also reveals joy without stimulation, a quiet contentment, a sense of being okay. This joy does not demand anything, it does not excite the ego, and because it is subtle, the mind may overlook it at first. Over time, as rest becomes more familiar, the fear diminishes. The nervous system learns that stillness is safe, that nothing bad happens when you stop, that you do not disappear. This learning is gradual. It happens through repeated experiences of resting and surviving. Each time you allow stillness and nothing collapses, trust builds. The fear of rest also fades as you see that pain is not necessary for meaning. Meaning can arise from presence, not struggle. This undermines the identity built on suffering. From a Buddhist lens, this is the loosening of attachment to dukkha, the habitual dissatisfaction that keeps the wheel turning. The mind has been using dissatisfaction as fuel. When dissatisfaction quiets, the wheel slows. This slowing can feel strange. Life feels less dramatic, less urgent, less defined, but it also feels more real. Stillness does not remove challenges, it changes how you meet them. Without habitual suffering, you respond rather than react. This is more efficient and less exhausting. The fear of rest is strongest just before rest becomes natural. It is the last defense of an identity built on tension. When that defense softens, rest becomes nourishment rather than threat. You begin to see that pain was never required for growth. That suffering was not proof of depth. That rest does not make you weak. Rest reveals a deeper strength. The strength to be present without drama. The strength to exist without justification. The strength to let life be as it is. And once this strength is known, the mind no longer fears rest. It welcomes it, not as escape, but as home. This is the quiet transformation emptiness brings. It shows you that peace was never dangerous. It was only unfamiliar. And familiarity grows with time, patience, and the courage to stop running. When rest is no longer feared, suffering loses its grip. The self no longer needs pain to feel real, and life unfolds with less resistance, more ease, and a deeper sense of truth. As rest becomes less threatening and the mind no longer needs pain to feel real, another subtle drive begins to lose its force. It does not vanish suddenly. It softens. The drive to become awakened, the urge to arrive at a higher state, the quiet ambition to be more evolved, more aware, more complete than before. What remains when even this falls away is often unexpected. Spiritual ambition usually begins with sincerity, a genuine wish to be free from suffering, a longing for truth, a desire to live with clarity and peace. But over time, this sincerity can quietly turn into striving. Awakening becomes a future achievement. Insight becomes something to accumulate. Practice becomes a way to improve the self. And without noticing, the ego finds a new job. The ego does not disappear when you turn toward spirituality. It adapts. It takes on refined language. It learns new values. It replaces worldly success with spiritual success. Instead of chasing money or status, it chases enlightenment, purity, or depth. The structure is the same, only the object changes. Emptiness begins to dismantle this structure gently. It reveals that spiritual ambition carries the same tension as any other ambition, the same sense of lack, the same postponement of peace. I will be okay once I awaken. I will rest once I understand. This keeps awakening safely out of reach, always in the future. This is why many people feel restless even after years of practice. They have insight, discipline, and knowledge, yet something still feels incomplete. The incompleteness is not a failure. It is the signal that striving has reached its limit. When emptiness deepens, the question, "How do I awaken?" begins to feel strange. Not because it is wrong, but because it assumes awakening is not already present. The mind starts to see that every effort to reach awakening is happening within awareness itself. Nothing is outside it. This realization does not come as a dramatic insight. It often arrives as fatigue, a weariness with seeking, a sense that chasing clarity is creating tension rather than dissolving it. This weariness is not apathy. It is wisdom beginning to emerge. Spiritual ambition relies on comparison, comparing your state to an imagined ideal, comparing your insight to others, comparing your calm to someone else's depth. Emptiness collapses comparison by collapsing self-reference. Without a solid self, there is no one to advance or lag behind. This collapse can feel disorienting. You may wonder if you are losing direction, if you are becoming complacent. But what is actually happening is a shift from effort-based awakening to recognition-based awakening. Recognition does not strive. It notices. It sees that awareness is already here, already open, already functioning. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be removed. The practices that once felt essential become optional supports rather than ladders. This does not mean practice stops. It means practice changes character. It is no longer driven by ambition. It becomes an expression of curiosity, care, or enjoyment. Meditation is no longer a means to an end. It is simply sitting. Inquiry is no longer about reaching an answer. It is about staying honest. The end of spiritual ambition also ends spiritual anxiety. The fear of doing it wrong, the worry about stagnation, the concern about missing something. These fears come from treating awakening as an achievement. When awakening is seen as a natural state, these fears lose ground. A natural state does not mean a permanent mood. It means a baseline of openness that allows all moods. Awakening is not constant bliss. It is the absence of resistance to experience. This absence does not need to be maintained. It is what happens when maintenance stops. Spiritual ambition often hides subtle self-rejection. I am not awake enough. I am still too reactive. I should be further along. These thoughts keep the self at the center. Emptiness removes this center. Without a center, self-judgment has nowhere to land. This is deeply relieving. You stop monitoring your state. You stop checking whether you are mindful enough. You stop grading your experience. Experience unfolds without commentary. Another aspect of spiritual ambition is control, the wish to control inner states, to maintain calm, to eliminate fear, to stabilize insight. Emptiness reveals that control is unnecessary and impossible. States arise and pass. Awareness remains. When control drops, there is trust. Trust not in an outcome, but in the process of life itself. This trust allows awakening to express naturally rather than being forced. The end of spiritual ambition also brings humility. Not the humility of self-doubt, but the humility of not knowing. You stop assuming you understand reality. You stop trying to package insight. This keeps perception fresh. Humility here is not a posture. It is the absence of claiming. You no longer claim awakening as mine. You no longer claim depth as an identity. This protects insight from turning into ego. One of the most freeing aspects of this shift is the end of spiritual performance. You no longer feel the need to appear calm, wise, or detached. You allow yourself to be human, messy, responsive, alive. This honesty deepens authenticity. Awakening as a natural state includes everything: confusion, clarity, joy, sadness. None of these threaten it. Spiritual ambition tries to curate experience. Emptiness allows it. This allowance reveals that awakening was never about escaping life. It was about fully inhabiting it without resistance. This does not look special. It looks ordinary. The mind may resist this ordinariness. It may feel disappointed. Is this it? This disappointment comes from expectation. Emptiness dissolves expectation by revealing that truth does not need to impress. Another important shift is the end of seeking validation through spirituality. You no longer need others to confirm your insight. You no longer measure progress through recognition. This reduces subtle competition and isolation. Spiritual ambition can also create separation. You feel different, apart, more aware than others. Emptiness dissolves this separation. You see that awareness is not personal, it is shared. This brings quiet compassion. When awakening is no longer a goal, action becomes simpler. You respond to situations without referencing a spiritual ideal. You help when help is needed. You rest when rest is needed. There is no internal commentary about what an awakened person should do. This simplicity is powerful. It removes inner conflict. You are no longer divided between who you are and who you think you should be. The end of spiritual ambition also ends the fear of regression. When awakening is seen as recognition rather than achievement, there is nothing to lose. States may change, insight may fluctuate, awareness remains. This removes pressure. You no longer guard your experience, you allow movement. This flexibility is stability. From a Buddhist perspective, this is the dropping of clinging even to the path. The raft is no longer carried once the river is crossed. The teachings are not discarded, but they are no longer burdens. This does not mean the path was unnecessary. It means the path did its job. It revealed what was always present. Emptiness shows that awakening was never something you had to reach. It was something obscured by effort, identity, and striving. When these fall away, awakening shines quietly. This quietness can be mistaken for dullness, but it is not dull, it is peaceful. Peaceful without needing protection. Peaceful without needing explanation. Another shift here is joy without cause, not excitement, not pleasure. A gentle gladness that comes from ease. This joy is not pursued. It arises naturally when striving ends. Spiritual ambition also often involves fear of death, fear of missing out, fear of not finishing the work. When awakening is no longer a project, these fears soften. Life is no longer something to complete, it is something to live. The end of ambition also ends the hierarchy of states. There is no higher or lower experience. There is only this one, unfolding. This removes judgment and preference. Awakening as a natural state does not mean you stop learning. It means learning is no longer about self-improvement. It is about curiosity. This makes learning joyful again. The most subtle and profound change is this. You stop relating to awakening as something separate from daily life. Washing dishes, walking, speaking, resting, all of it is included. There is no special zone. This integration is the true sign that spiritual ambition has ended. Life is no longer divided into spiritual and non-spiritual. Everything belongs. Emptiness brings this integration by removing the seeker. When there is no one trying to awaken, awakening is free to be recognized. And in that recognition, something deeply reassuring becomes clear. You were never behind. You were never unawakened. You were simply busy trying to get somewhere you already were. When the effort to arrive ends, what remains is simple presence. Not dramatic, not perfect. Just here. This is awakening without ambition. Freedom without striving. Emptiness lived as life itself. As striving fades and awakening is no longer treated as something to reach, A quiet openness settles in. There is no next milestone, no inner checklist, no promise of becoming something better. And in this absence of expectation, something deeply healing begins to work on its own. Expectation is a subtle form of control. Even positive expectations carry tension. When you expect peace, you are measuring the present against a future state. When you expect healing, you are implying that something is still wrong now. These expectations may sound hopeful, but they quietly reject what is already happening. Emptiness heals because it removes this rejection. When nothing is expected, the nervous system relaxes. There is no pressure to produce an outcome, no demand to feel a certain way, no timeline to meet. This lack of demand creates safety, and safety is the foundation of all healing. Much of suffering comes not from pain itself, but from the insistence that pain should not be here. Expectation fuels this insistence. I should be over this. This should be working by now. I shouldn't feel like this anymore. These thoughts tighten the system. They create friction. Emptiness removes the should. When emptiness offers no promise, the mind cannot bargain. There is nothing to negotiate with, no deal to strike, no future reward to chase. This stops the endless loop of hoping and disappointment. Without hope, there is no despair. There is simply what is. This may sound bleak, but it is not. Hope and despair are two sides of the same structure. Both rely on expectation. When expectation dissolves, a different quality emerges. Acceptance, not as resignation, but as openness. Healing that comes without expectation is gentle. It does not announce itself. It does not follow a straight line. It unfolds quietly because it is not being watched. When you stop monitoring progress, the system can reorganize naturally. The body especially heals best without expectation. The nervous system does not respond well to pressure. When you demand calm, it resists. When you demand release, it tightens. When nothing is expected, the body feels permission to do what it knows how to do. This is why emptiness works where effort fails. Effort is future-oriented. It is always about getting somewhere else. Emptiness is present-oriented. It allows what is here to complete itself. Another important aspect is trust. When you expect nothing, you are not giving up. You are trusting the process of life without trying to manage it. This trust is not blind. It is built from experience. Each time you stop forcing and nothing breaks, trust deepens. Expectation also creates hierarchy. Some experiences are seen as good, others as bad. Healing experiences are valued. Difficult ones are rejected. Emptiness flattens this hierarchy. All experiences are allowed. This allowance reduces inner conflict. Inner conflict drains energy. It keeps the system in a state of resistance. When conflict ends, energy becomes available for repair, integration, and clarity. When nothing is expected, emotions change how they move. They are not evaluated. They are not judged as signs of progress or failure. They are felt and released. This reduces emotional fatigue. Expectation often turns healing into a performance. You watch yourself heal. You measure improvement. You compare yourself to others. This performance creates self-consciousness. Emptiness removes the audience. Without an audience, there is no performance. There is only experience. This also changes how insight functions. Insights are no longer collected as achievements. They arise and pass naturally. They inform action without becoming identity. This keeps the mind light. Another subtle healing occurs in relationships. When you expect nothing from yourself, you stop expecting others to complete you. You stop demanding specific outcomes. This reduces tension. It increases presence. Expectation also fuels disappointment. When things do not go as hoped, frustration arises. Emptiness prevents this cycle by not promising anything. There is nothing to be disappointed about. This does not make life dull. it makes it resilient. Resilience does not come from positive outcomes. It comes from flexibility. When you are not attached to a particular result, you adapt more easily. Emptiness cultivates this adaptability. One of the deepest healings here is the end of self-surveillance. You stop watching yourself to see if you are okay. This watching keeps anxiety alive. When it stops, the mind settles. The healing that comes when nothing is expected is also honest. It does not bypass pain. It does not promise relief. It simply allows truth. And truth, when allowed, tends to heal. This approach respects timing. Some things resolve quickly, others take longer. Without expectation, you do not rush the process. You do not interfere. You allow integration at its own pace. Another important shift is the end of transactional thinking. You stop treating practices, insights, or behaviors as means to an end. You meditate because you meditate. You rest because you rest. This removes hidden pressure. Transactional thinking keeps the mind restless. It is always calculating. Emptiness ends calculation. This is deeply calming. The absence of expectation also heals shame. Shame relies on comparison to an ideal. When there is no ideal to meet, shame has nothing to cling to. You stop judging yourself for not being somewhere else. This does not mean you stop learning or growing. Growth continues, but without self-punishment. You adjust naturally because clarity increases, not because you force change. The mind may initially resist this. It may say, if I expect nothing, nothing will happen. This fear comes from a misunderstanding. Expectation does not cause healing. It often delays it. Think of how the body heals a cut. It does not need encouragement. It does not need pressure. It needs space, rest, and time. Emptiness provides these conditions for the psyche. Another aspect of this healing is simplicity. Without expectation, life feels simpler. Decisions are made based on what is appropriate now, not on long-term identity goals. This reduces overwhelm. The mind also becomes less future-focused. Anxiety decreases because anxiety feeds on imagined outcomes. When you stop expecting, the future loses its grip. Attention returns to the present. This present-centeredness is not forced mindfulness. It is a natural consequence of letting go of outcomes. You are here because there is nowhere else you need to be. The healing that comes without expectation also changes how you relate to setbacks. There are no setbacks if there is no destination. There are only movements. This perspective reduces discouragement. Another subtle benefit is patience. Not forced patience, but natural patience. When you are not waiting for something, time feels different. Moments are complete in themselves. This completeness is healing. It counters the sense of lack that drives so much suffering. You realize that you are not incomplete while waiting to become complete. Emptiness offers no reward, and this is its greatest gift. Rewards create attachment. Attachment creates fear of loss. Without reward, there is nothing to lose. This does not make life empty of joy. It makes joy freer. Joy arises without expectation and fades without clinging. This fluidity prevents suffering. The absence of promise also prevents spiritual bypassing. You cannot use emptiness to avoid life. There is no promise of escape. You must meet experience as it is. This honesty is grounding. When nothing is expected, gratitude becomes natural, not because things are good, but because they are. Existence itself feels sufficient. This sufficiency is not complacency, it is contentment. Contentment does not stop action, it stops struggle. The healing described here is quiet. It does not create stories. It does not demand recognition. It simply unfolds as tension releases. Over time, you may notice that problems resolve themselves without your involvement. or they lose their emotional charge even if they remain. This is because resistance has ended. The mind eventually learns that emptiness is not withholding something, it is offering freedom from demand. This freedom is deeply soothing. The greatest healing comes from realizing that you do not need to be promised anything in order to rest. You do not need assurance. You do not need a guarantee. Life is happening. Awareness is present. That is enough. When nothing is expected, the system finally relaxes into itself. And in that relaxation, healing happens not because you tried, but because you stopped getting in the way. This is the paradox of emptiness. It heals precisely because it offers nothing. As expectation dissolves and healing no longer depends on outcomes, a deeper honesty becomes possible. Without promises to chase, without rewards to wait for, there is nothing left to protect. And when nothing needs protection, emotions are finally allowed to arrive fully, without being pushed away or pulled closer. This is where a new space opens, one that most people have never learned how to enter. Most emotional suffering does not come from feeling emotions. It comes from how the mind reacts to them. The moment an emotion appears, the mind usually chooses one of two strategies. It avoids the emotion, or it indulges it. Avoidance numbs. Indulgence amplifies. Both keep the emotion stuck. Emptiness offers a third way. Emotional avoidance is often subtle. It does not always look like suppression. It can look like distraction, analysis, productivity, positivity, or even spirituality. The mind learns many clever ways to not feel. It jumps into thinking. It explains the emotion instead of experiencing it. It reframes it, fixes it, or bypasses it. All of these strategies are attempts to escape discomfort. Indulgence is the opposite reaction, but it has the same result. The mind dives into the emotion. It builds stories around it. It relives memories. It fuels the emotion with meaning. It justifies it. This makes the emotion feel important, but it also makes it heavy and long-lasting. Both avoidance and indulgence share one belief, that emotions are dangerous or defining. Avoidance says, if I feel this, something bad will happen. Indulgence says, if I feel this, it must mean something important about me. Emptiness dissolves both beliefs by removing the central self they revolve around. When emptiness deepens, emotions arise in a wider space. They are not resisted, but they are not fed either. They are allowed to be exactly what they are, temporary movements of sensation. This allows emotions to complete themselves naturally. The space beyond emotional avoidance is not numbness. It is presence. Numbness disconnects you from feeling. Presence connects you to feeling without entanglement. This distinction is crucial. In this space, emotions are felt in the body rather than interpreted by the mind. You notice heat, pressure, tightness, vibration, softness. You feel the raw data of emotion without translating it into narrative. This keeps emotion grounded in the present moment, where it can move and change. Avoidance freezes emotion. Indulgence circulates it endlessly. Presence allows it to flow. This is why emptiness is so effective. It does not interfere with the natural process. Many people fear that if they stop avoiding emotions, they will be overwhelmed. This fear comes from past experiences where emotion was met without support. Emptiness provides support not by controlling emotion, but by offering space. Space prevents overwhelm because nothing is compressed. When emotion arises in emptiness, there is room around it. It does not fill the whole field. It is seen as part of experience, not the totality. This perspective reduces intensity without suppressing anything. Another important aspect is time. Emotional avoidance often comes from fear that the emotion will never end. Indulgence comes from fear that the emotion will be ignored or invalidated. Emptiness shows that emotions have their own timing. They rise, they peak, they dissolve. No intervention is needed. This process rebuilds trust in the body. The nervous system learns that emotions are survivable, that they do not need to be managed aggressively. This learning happens through repeated direct experience, not through reassurance. The space beyond avoidance also ends emotional bargaining. The mind often negotiates with emotion. If I feel this now, I won't later. If I understand this, it will go away. These bargains keep attention locked on emotion. Emptiness removes negotiation by removing the negotiator. When there is no one trying to control emotion, emotion has nothing to push against. Resistance is what gives emotion its staying power. Without resistance, emotions lose their grip. This does not mean emotions disappear instantly. It means they do not accumulate. They pass through without layering. This prevents emotional backlog, which is a major source of chronic distress. Another shift here is the end of emotional identity. Many people define themselves by how they feel. I am anxious. I am angry. I am sensitive. Emptiness reveals that these are experiences, not identities. This reduces self-judgment and rigidity. The space beyond avoidance also changes how you relate to pleasure. Pleasure is no longer chased or clung to. It is enjoyed and released. This prevents addiction and disappointment. Emptiness allows emotions to dissolve without resistance or indulgence because it removes the urgency around them. Urgency is created by fear and desire. When both soften, emotion loses its drama. This space is not something you create. It appears when you stop interfering. The mind cannot manufacture it because effort collapses it. It emerges when effort relaxes. You may notice that emotions feel shorter in duration. They still arise, but they do not linger. This is not suppression. It is completion. Another important aspect is compassion. When you stop avoiding your own emotions, you become more tolerant of others. You listen without fixing. You empathize without absorbing. This deepens relationships. Avoidance often creates distance in relationships. Indulgence creates conflict. Presence creates connection. Emptiness supports presence. This approach also prevents emotional burnout. Constantly managing emotions is exhausting. When you allow emotions to self-regulate, energy returns. The space beyond emotional avoidance also changes decision-making. You no longer make choices to escape feelings. You respond to situations directly. This leads to clearer action. Emptiness also reduces fear of vulnerability. When emotions are allowed without identity, vulnerability is no longer threatening. It is simply openness. This openness does not make you fragile. It makes you resilient. Resilience comes from flexibility, not armor. Another subtle benefit is honesty. You stop lying to yourself about how you feel. You stop pretending to be okay or pretending to be broken. You allow truth without embellishment. This honesty heals inner division. Parts of you no longer fight each other. This creates internal coherence. The space beyond avoidance is not passive. It is alert, aware, and responsive. You are fully present with what is happening without being consumed. This is different from detachment. Detachment distances. Presence includes. Emptiness includes everything without preference. Emotions dissolve in this space because they are no longer held in place by thought. Thought is the glue that keeps emotions stuck. When thought relaxes, glue dissolves. You may notice that even intense emotions lose their edge. Grief is felt without despair. Anger is felt without violence. Fear is felt without panic. This is emotional maturity without control. This maturity is not learned. It emerges naturally when emptiness becomes familiar. The space beyond emotional avoidance also restores playfulness. Without fear of emotion, you engage more freely. You laugh more easily. You respond creatively. Another healing effect is reduced rumination. When emotions are allowed to complete, there is nothing to replay. The mind moves on naturally. This reduces insomnia, anxiety, and mental fatigue. The system rests more deeply. Emptiness does not eliminate emotional pain. It eliminates emotional suffering. Pain may still arise. Suffering does not have to. This distinction is key. Pain is part of life. Suffering is the added resistance. The space beyond avoidance allows pain to be part of experience without becoming the center of it. This changes everything. As you live from this space, emotions become information rather than threats. They guide action without dominating it. This guidance is subtle. It does not shout. It whispers. And because the mind is quieter, it can listen. Over time, the fear of emotion fades. You trust your capacity to feel. This trust is empowering. The healing described here is not dramatic. It does not feel like a breakthrough. It feels like relief, the relief of no longer fighting yourself. And in that relief, emotions are finally free to do what they were always meant to do: move, communicate, and dissolve. This is the space emptiness opens. A space where nothing is avoided, nothing is indulged, and nothing is trapped. A space where experience flows, life breathes, and healing happens quietly, without effort. As emotions are finally allowed to move without being avoided or indulged, another pattern becomes visible. A quiet tightening, a background urge to manage what might happen next. Even when nothing is wrong, the mind prepares, plans, monitors, adjusts. This is the reflex of control. And when emptiness deepens, this reflex begins to loosen in a way effort never could. Control is usually mistaken for care. People believe that if they manage their thoughts, emotions, schedules, and outcomes carefully enough, they will be safe. Anxiety thrives inside this belief. It convinces the mind that vigilance equals protection. Letting go feels irresponsible, dangerous, yet emptiness reveals something different. Control does not prevent anxiety, it creates it. Anxiety is not a failure of coping. It is the cost of constant management. The mind stays tense because it believes something bad will happen if it relaxes. Every coping strategy reinforces this belief by implying that anxiety must be handled, reduced, or fixed. Emptiness does not handle anxiety. It removes the handler. Effort-based coping treats anxiety as a problem separate from the self. It introduces techniques, reframes, and strategies. These can help temporarily, but they often keep the control structure intact. The mind learns, I must do something to be okay. This belief ensures that anxiety returns whenever effort weakens. Emptiness dissolves control faster because it removes the belief that control is necessary. When there is no one managing experience, experience manages itself. This is not neglect. It is trust in the natural intelligence of the system. The need for control comes from fear of uncertainty. The mind wants guarantees. It wants to know how things will turn out. Anxiety is the mind rehearsing the future in an attempt to avoid surprise. Emptiness interrupts this rehearsal by bringing attention out of time and into presence. Presence does not promise safety. It offers reality. And reality, when met directly, is often less threatening than imagined futures. Anxiety feeds on imagination, not on what is actually happening. When you rest in emptiness, you notice that most anxious thoughts are anticipatory. They are about what might happen. In emptiness, attention settles into what is happening. This shift alone reduces anxiety without effort. Control also depends on a sense of agency that is exaggerated. The mind believes it is responsible for preventing all negative outcomes. This belief is exhausting. Emptiness reveals the limits of control gently. You see that many things happen without your involvement, and yet life continues. This realization is both humbling and relieving. You are not as powerful as anxiety told you. and because of that, you are freer. Effort-based coping often turns into self-surveillance. You watch your thoughts, you track your feelings, you assess your state. This constant monitoring keeps anxiety alive. Emptiness removes the watcher. Without a watcher, there is nothing to monitor. Anxiety loses momentum when it is not being observed as a problem. It may still arise, but it is not fed by attention. This is not avoidance, it is non-interference. Control also creates inner conflict. One part of you wants to relax. Another insists on staying alert. This conflict drains energy. Emptiness ends conflict by dissolving the controller. There is no one left to argue. This does not mean you become passive. You still respond to situations. You still take action when needed. But action arises from clarity rather than fear. This is a profound difference. Coping strategies often rely on distraction or reframing. They move attention away from anxiety or change how it is interpreted. Emptiness does neither. It allows anxiety to arise in a wider space. This space prevents anxiety from dominating experience. Anxiety thrives in narrow attention. It collapses the field around threat. Emptiness widens the field. Anxiety becomes one sensation among many. This reduces its intensity naturally. Another reason control dissolves faster in emptiness is that emptiness does not argue with anxiety. Arguing keeps anxiety engaged. Emptiness is neutral. It does not try to convince anxiety to leave. It simply does not invite it to stay. The mind often fears that without control, chaos will follow. But chaos usually comes from over-control. When systems are rigid, they break under stress. When systems are flexible, they adapt. Emptiness cultivates flexibility. You are not locked into plans. You respond to conditions as they arise. This responsiveness is more reliable than preemptive control. Control also creates tension in the body. Muscles tighten, breath shortens. The nervous system stays activated. Emptiness allows the body to downshift. This physiological change is crucial for anxiety healing. When the body relaxes, the mind follows. This sequence cannot be reversed through effort. You cannot think your way into relaxation. You can allow your way into it. Effort-based coping often treats anxiety as an enemy. You fight it. You resist it. This battle reinforces anxiety's importance. Emptiness does not fight. It includes. Inclusion is powerful. When anxiety is included, it loses its oppositional role. It is no longer something to defeat. It becomes an experience that comes and goes. Control also maintains the illusion of permanence. The mind tries to lock in good states and avoid bad ones. This is impossible because experience is always changing. Emptiness aligns with impermanence. It does not try to freeze anything. This alignment reduces anxiety because anxiety is often fear of change. When change is accepted, fear softens. Another aspect is trust in uncertainty. Emptiness does not remove uncertainty. It removes the demand to resolve it. This demand is what creates anxiety. Uncertainty becomes tolerable when you stop requiring certainty to feel okay. This tolerance grows through experience, not belief. Effort-based coping often fails under intense anxiety because effort collapses under pressure. Emptiness does not rely on effort, so it remains available even when anxiety is strong. This makes emptiness a more reliable refuge. You do not need to remember techniques. You do not need to do anything. You simply stop interfering. Stopping interference is not a decision, it is a letting go. This letting go can happen even in the middle of anxiety. Control also fuels self-blame. When anxiety persists, you think you are doing something wrong. Emptiness removes this narrative. Anxiety is no longer a personal failure. It is just an experience. This reduces secondary anxiety, the anxiety about anxiety. Secondary anxiety is often more painful than the original sensation. When control dissolves, the system begins to self-regulate. This is how healing actually happens. The body knows how to return to balance when it is not constantly overridden. This self-regulation is subtle. It does not feel like a dramatic shift. It feels like fewer spikes, shorter duration, less reactivity. Over time, anxiety loses